Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University. My name is Joseph Kearney, and it is a great privilege for me as Dean of the Law School to welcome you to the Lubar Center. Let me say a few words here at the outset. Over the past decade or so, but especially since we opened Eckstein Hall in 2010, the law school has claimed a role with respect to public policy research and civic education. Our programs take a number of forms, and we have a well-established track record of offering engaged citizens, which is to say all of you, among others, the opportunity to learn from significant individuals and to become better informed about major issues facing Milwaukee, the region, and beyond. These efforts include the On the Issues with Mike Goucher programs, now in their 11th year, the Marquette Law School poll, now completing its 6th year, and conferences that we have hosted focusing on major issues. The topics of the conferences have really been quite varied, ranging from everything such as the future of Milwaukee in the so-called Chicago megacity to such topics as the balance between privacy and national security. We now group these various programs together under the rubric of the Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. So that's a sort of general introduction. One of Marquette University's biggest specific interests is education, not only at the college and graduate level, but K-12 education. It is, after all, a forefront issue for Milwaukee and Wisconsin. So we at the law school have considered ourselves very fortunate to be able to make common cause on a number of occasions with Marquette University's College of Education. Indeed, today, simply for the sake of efficiency, I'm speaking on behalf also of my friend and longtime colleague, Dean Bill Hank of the Marquette University College of Education. Make me sound good is what he told me right before the conference. These past occasions also have been rather varied. We have covered such topics together as urban education initiatives across the nation and what Milwaukee might learn from them, the impact and future of nationwide standardized testing of students, what successful urban schools are doing to achieve good outcomes for students, the future of Catholic K-12 education, the record of charter schools across the country, and a number of other topics yet. We also have hosted a number of programs that we've called One Conversation, Two Points of View, featuring major figures with differing views on various publicly funded topics, such as vouchers and charter school. Today's conference brings together two nationally known experts on education policy, as well as several significant local educators, to focus on what K-12 students need to succeed, particularly in social and emotional respects, as well as the traditional academic front. Our goal is not to advocate for any particular position or policy, but to offer an audience such as you and others who will watch this online the opportunity for better understanding and food for thought, and perhaps hereafter the opportunity for action on your part according to your more informed judgment. There are three main segments this morning, though only one break, as the schedule reflects, and my colleague Alan Borsick is going to introduce and present the first. Another law school colleague, Mike Goucher, will present the second, or at least the bulk of it. After a short break, then, Professor Cynthia Elwood of Marquette University's College of Education will moderate the panel discussion that is the third segment. Alan Borsick is Senior Fellow in Law and Public Policy here at the law school, and he bears much of the responsibility, I will claim most of the credit, for leading today's program. So, no, very much credit. So without more, let me hand it over to him, though not without saying thank you to all of you for being here with us this morning. Welcome.
And I second the Dean's last comment of thanking all of you for being here, and I do want to thank him and the law school as a whole, the generous support of the Lubar family, and the support of the College of Education for making it possible to do these kinds of events. I admit I didn't invite our two main speakers because they are in themselves great leaders in the social emotional education movement, which it has been a hot subject. I invited them for two reasons, because they both have such good handles and interesting handles on the broader picture, and more specifically because they each wrote pieces that I read over the last few months about social and emotional aspects of learning that I found interesting and provocative. In the case of Chester Finn, we'll get to in a little while. It was a piece in Ed Week. Andre Perry is a regular columnist for an online education news organization called the Hechinger Report, which is very much worth reading. So I invited them here because I want to have an interesting conversation. And it'll be a little broader than just social emotional learning, I expect, and that's good. Andre Perry is, just as of a few months ago, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He has a long history in New Orleans, professor at the University of New Orleans, and head of a charter network in New Orleans, author, or co-author, I guess, of a book that came out at the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina called School by School, The Transformation of New Orleans Public Education. Has a PhD from the University of Maryland in educational administration, educational leadership.
Education policy.
Education policy. Got to get that straight. We actually tried to get him here, must be 5 years ago, when we did an event focused on what can be learned from New Orleans. So he dragged his feet a little bit, but here he is. And I'm going to we're going to go, here's how we're going to do this. And frankly, we just reshuffled this last night. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. I expect we will take some questions from you near the end of that. Then Chester Finn is going to talk with Mike Goucher for about 45 minutes, and then both of them will be up here talking with each other and with you for about 30 minutes. So that's the sequence of what we're going to do in this portion of the program. Let me begin with the general question. You've written several pieces in recent months saying if you want to reach particularly African American students, I think you were referring to, you got to understand the context of their lives and deal with the context of their lives.
Yeah, first, thank everyone for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. I am a father, and I have three remarkable children of varying ability levels. And when it comes to social and emotional learning, my second child really informs me why we need these approaches and why our dismissal or overinvestment in academic learning has dismissed very important aspects of people's lives. I have our middle child is technically labeled intellectually disabled. He is 21 now, but he probably reads at the level of a first grader. He has since first grade. He didn't change at any point, yet I still wanted the most for my child. When he went to school, I had a few basic things. I wanted him to be kind. I wanted him to be in an environment where he was a brother or a sister to other children. I wanted him to be a respectable citizen. I wanted him to work and contribute to overall society. The reason why I generally support social emotional learning is because if it was about academics, my son would not be working today. He would not be a kind and loving person. He generally is on track to enjoy many of the accoutrements of a working class or middle class household. It's not because he learned a great deal in math and in English. It's because he is socially and emotionally sound. He worked all the other intelligences that was at his disposal. So for me, yes, academics is important. But this idea that somehow, some way, if we can increase math and learning, our lives are going to be improved, particularly for Black people, is a complete farce. And for me, it's personal because it sort of suggests that it was our fault that we're not as socially mobile as other groups who, by the way, perform higher on academic standards. No. And I say this quite frequently, there's nothing broken with Black people that ending racism can't solve. This is not an issue of academics. But yet, we build structures to move the needle, a few inches. Move the ball a few inches, and it's important. But I'm more interested in reform that looks at the entire context of a child's life. I'm more interested in change that gets at the underlying problems of why folks aren't socially mobile. And it's not because they have a bad algebra teacher.
So what can you expect from a school? How would you structure a school day or a school culture to deal with these things? I mean, you've worked in schools, you've certainly been observing schools intensely for years.
Well, I don't think the schools that are in suburbs should look any different than those in the inner city. Another thing that I've noticed, we treat Black districts like Black people. And so we want to break them up. We want to change them. We want to, do all these, tinker with them, experiment with them, jail them, take them over. But when in fact we know that great leadership, capable teachers, engaged parents are sort of the building blocks of a good school. And so where some of my colleagues don't really know where I fall because I've always said, with advancements in modernity and technology, the way school looks will change. It's supposed to change. And I certainly do believe that in this ed reform space, what we've learned, that there needs to be some decentralization and some centralization in areas that that should to protect abuse in some cases. But this tinkering with governance structures isn't the reason why Black and brown children aren't successful in life. There are big things in the way in terms of racism, in terms of discrimination, that block my chances from achieving at the same level somebody with my educational level, somebody with my background achieved. I mean, it is the data are clear on this. And we at Brookings, we do a lot of reporting on social mobility. And we know that this is a generational roadblock we're facing in the sense of people who, for Black men in particular, for centuries, have not been afforded the same luxuries when you control for the same outcomes. I mean, this is not, there's something bigger at play.
So what would it take to change that?
Oh, so,
As specific policies,
Yeah.
Well, we can have 10 words.
Yeah. And this is where I am. The reason why I moved from a school space to a city space is because
Where's your own academic?
my academic focus and my practitioner focus. Kids don't live in schools. schools reside in communities. We have got to fix communities in ways that we haven't in the past. And that means investing in communities. After Katrina, nothing informed my thinking until after Katrina. We spent billions of dollars. And I'll just give you the cliff note. We are essentially the same, economically speaking, as we were before Katrina.
In New Orleans
In
specifically?
New Orleans.
Yeah.
We rebuilt New Orleans to essentially to be old New Orleans. We had we saw at least 3 state budgets worth of money poured into things like education, housing, transportation, all of these different things, which I was a part of. But we did not invest in the black people that utilize those services. So when in education, we spent billions on building schools. We've given millions to local nonprofits, mainly white-led, mainly disconnected from the community, mainly the people who were part of the problem in the first place. So when you invest in people who are truly not invested in black communities, you get what you get. So yes, we can get a shiny new building, and the life chances of children are pretty much the same. And you'll hear, well, there are fewer failing schools in New Orleans, and that's up to debate because we've certainly moved the metrics of what is failing time and time again. Currently, 41% of the schools in New Orleans are deemed or that receive an F or a D. And if you can imagine, if somebody told you your hospital had a 41% failure rate, you wouldn't be screaming and hollering about the successful New Orleans experiment. More importantly, again, education is supposed to change to enable you to be socially mobile. And I don't think it does that in the way, in terms of our current reform structures, are elevating people to be socially mobile. And this goes to social emotional learning. Again, I believe in this stuff. But most social and emotional programs are essentially teaching children how to adjust to broken systems, how to look a hotel worker in the eye and say, "Thank you, sir. I'm not going to be angry. I'm not, that I shouldn't be angry, that I shouldn't," and if you're living in places like Milwaukee, New Orleans, certain parts in DC, you should be angry. This is part of being a human, adjusting to the conditions you're in. People weren't born this way. And so, again, I believe in going to social emotional learning. I believe in this stuff. But I also believe in giving students the skills that are necessary to elevate themselves out of this condition. And to me, it does look like, and one of the articles I wrote, I talked about a justice organization that trained kids how to protest the criminal justice system in New Orleans. To me, that's more important than teaching kids, quote unquote, soft skills and grit training. What we need is people to understand that the cards are stacked against them, and to internalize that so they can have the skills to combat it. This isn't, for me, when I speak in different audiences, I am clear that the overall data is depressing. Race and class, there's so much social determinism with those issues. We should be depressed. We should be angry. We should. There's a big debate about Ta-Nehisi Coates and whether or not there's hope. But when you look in the aggregate, a oh, it is depressing, and it should be, because things haven't changed much. Now, I always say that you should find hope in the pragmatists and the teachers and the policymakers and the people who are actually making change and showing progress in our communities. But yes, kids should not feel great about their situations in certain schools. And one more thing, going back to my son who's intellectually disabled, his life outcomes are extraordinarily different than someone who's low income. Someone in his position, he's working because he was in a solidly middle class, upper middle class home. He is well adjusted, he can't read, and he's thriving. It's not, and social networks, all of these things matter. But this idea that it's going to be, we can figure out a way to make a better a mathematically driven kid is somehow going to elevate him and his family out of poverty. There is no, in fact, I'll let you get to your question. Great. Now the research is showing, Jesse Rothstein out of Berkeley, they came out with a piece essentially challenging Ross Chetty's work on social mobility. Ross Chetty essentially found that school quality had a significant bearing on social mobility. And that never really made sense to me, because I always said kids don't live in schools, they live in communities and all that stuff. And now what the research is finding, we oversell school quality. It matters, but in terms of social mobility, and that's what education is for. It's not to, you're not going to get paid for an increase in standardized test scores. You're not going to, the one thing that you do, the one test score that matters is ACT, and that's been pretty much, or ACT, SAT, college entrance, that's been pretty stagnant for the last 20 years, for the most part. But, we're not handing out mortgages because state achievement scores went up. There's no value for this stuff, except for the people who run them, the test companies, the policymakers, the people like me who get attention. That's who benefits, who really gets tangible human capital goods. So again, schools will change. Charter schools, magnet schools, community schools, these things come and go. But it's not revolutionary.
I totally appreciate what you said about your son and that he's doing well with very limited reading. On the whole, though, across the, it's been one of my core understandings that you're really not going to go anywhere in life if you can't read. We have in Milwaukee, across all the sectors of schools, approximately 20% of kids are regarded as proficient in reading. Almost half of kids in the mid-40s are in the bottom category in the state testing, which is to say, I think that's listed as below basic now. And we're talking about kids up through 10th grade. You say, these kids have to learn how to read if they're going to go anywhere in life.
Oh, yeah.
Number one, am I right about that?
Oh, yeah.
Number two, then, what can schools, how does that need to learn to read, to do math, to understand the world, balance against the social, the communities that they're coming from, the social needs and circumstances they're in? I'm somewhat a small historian of black education, and one of the things that you see throughout the great black scholars is this idea for education for to be self-deterministic, to be self-reliant, because in the main,
since Reconstruction at least, there was a belief, and it is warranted, that we have got to be able to run our own communities because other communities will not allow you in mainstream, in the mainstream. You see that right now in terms of the tech field. And this, again, this farce about there's a pipeline problem. There's not a pipeline problem with black people in tech. It's a problem with venture capitalists investing in black tech workers. You know, in this thing, yes, reading is important, but don't get it twisted. The data is clear on this. White folks with a high school diploma pretty much earn the same as black folks with a college degree. I mean, something's wrong with that. Reading is important. Don't ever get me wrong. It's really not just reading. The ability to understand your social context using words, using numbers, using art, using culture, all of these things matter. And when one is not available to you, you maximize the others. If two is not there, you maximize the others. Black folk have been doing that forever. Being able to read doesn't make you less intelligent. You know, having an accent doesn't make you less smart. But the outcomes of education differ, not because of their reading level. And that's what essentially my point is. We can abdicate our responsibility for doing all the other things to bring justice to children by saying, if we can only fix a school, and that's what we constantly do. We have to be accountable. Schools have to be accountable. If not, we'll take them away. And guess what that does? One of the question I used to hate when I was a school leader, I hated this question. That was, what's the fastest way to close the black-white achievement gap? I was
just going to ask that.
Yeah. Right? You know, and I used to, look, and some people would say all these fancy curriculum things. I said, well, no, the fastest way to close the black-white achievement gap is to stop educating white people. That's the fastest way, right? Now, we will never do that for obvious reasons. But guess what we will do? Fire all the black teachers, expel all the black children, do all these other nefarious things to close the black achievement gap. If you believe all kids can learn, this question of how can we do it, I mean, can it be done, which you often see in news, like, can we transform an urban district? Yeah, the question is always, how do you do it? And if you're going to negate all the other things that bring social mobility to a community, then you have no idea what social justice is. Education is not just about improving achievement. And I hate when people say things like, well, it's not a human resource center. We shouldn't just hire people. But schools are businesses. They are economic drivers of communities. They are also builders of human capital. But this is what we do in school ed reform. We say, oh, we have to have kids learning at a certain level. And I'm always like, or what? There are going to be much more jobs for them? Show me that evidence. But I will show you white outcomes with a high school diploma that are better than those with blacks with a college degree. So, I mean, again, don't get me wrong. School is important. I believe in school. My kids I push them academically. I push them socially. I push them in all other ways. But one thing I do put in their education is to understand that this schooling is not the thing that's going to elevate you to another level. It's going to be much more political. It's going to be much more economic. All the things that white general education reformers don't touch because they say it's mushy. They'll say, we can't control that. And it's like, give me a break. You do control that. I mean, when I go to my suburban friends' schools, they know full well who's contracted for bus services, who runs their schools. I mean, there's a tight system. It is much more, there's a more cohesive group of people, generally middle class, that there, and whenever you have diversity, it's harder to make decisions. But we're not screaming, oh, the schools are broken in the suburbs because they're the wrong structure. But in black districts all across the country, we are tearing them apart, negating all the other social capital avenues that would advance a community. So,
Is there a place that's doing better on these scores at urban
I mean, yeah,
center?
I think there are pockets of performance. I mean, even in New Orleans, I will say this. I think the intensity of change after the storm, you saw improvements. But, oh man, the poverty rate is as high, if not higher. The incarceration rate isn't going anywhere. The joblessness and unemployment rate are pretty much stagnant. At some point, you see test scores go like this. You should see some corollary data in other areas. It's not happening. But I do see nonprofits, organizations, oh, their budgets are going like this, and their lifestyles are going like that. Again, we're not investing into people that actually need investment. It is not the rearranging of furniture that we need new investments in actual people. So and this is where it's a big split, because some people believe, I mean, they don't know if I'm a reformer or not, and but I definitely do believe in school change, because like I said, we should not see the same systems we've seen in the past. Just because times have changed, technology has changed. I mean, every aspect of our life has changed, so should schools.
So if you were in charge of a school, if you were principal of a school right now, what would you want that school, that staff, to do to help students with the social emotional issues that they have? A lot of them come to school with really difficult circumstances in their lives. What should the school do about it?
Well, I can be very technical. I would, and I tried to do this as a school leader. One thing, I would try to ban suspension and expulsion. Ban it. And the reason why is because we really don't know ways to treat black children that falls outside the realm of punishment. Discipline in our heads is about punishment. And it's not just for teachers, parents. I mean, African Americans are still one of the highest proponents of corporal punishment. We punish districts. Well, I mean, it's the takeover district is slowing. The idea of it is slowing. But we take over everything, punish everything in black people's lives. So I would ban punishment just so we can see, oh, there is a better way to change behavior than suspension, expulsion, in-school suspension, putting a kid in a closet, so on and so forth. Because if you ever send your kid, or you probably have, probably many people in this room have, if you go to a Tony private school, my son is in a public school now, but he was in essentially the top private school in New Orleans. There would be no way a kid would, I mean, no one gets suspended, expelled, punished.
If I'm a teacher, and we've got teachers and superintendents and principals in the room here, and I got a kid in the room who's disruptive, who's misbehaving, who's mouthing off to me, who's totally out of line. What am I supposed to do?
But
saying, you go to the principal's office, we're going to, take you out of here for a day or something. It seems like what's a better alternative?
well, one thing, also the data is clear. There are some people who know how to treat children better than others. There are some classrooms where you don't see the same problems. But as a rule, I actually do believe there's a human power issue in schools. I don't think there's enough people in the building. I really do believe in having at least 2 teachers in a classroom. I also believe that colleges of education, Marquette, should have partnerships where the kids our students are learning in real time as aides in a building. I used to,
we do a fair amount of that, just by the way.
Yeah. So I used to hate the standard student-teacher thing. You go after your program. You should be in classrooms as soon as you think you're a teacher. One, just to build capacity of the local district. And this is the other thing. The teacher turnover rate are high, largely because a lot of kids really don't, I keep saying kids, a lot of students don't know what they're getting into. And so I've always said, hey, the way to deal with this human power issue is have teachers or aspiring teachers, or even not. If you're a math student, I really believe in service requirements. Go into that classroom, be a teacher's aide, really just to provide some relief so that teacher can differentiate instruction, so that teacher can deal with Jamal who's acting up, and to give that kid an avenue. Because what I did learn from, what I do learn from the Teach for America movement is that you can compel smart kids to go into schools. What I didn't like is you don't have to travel from Milwaukee to New Orleans to find a troubled school to work in. You could go next door. And so I do believe that College of Education really do need to figure out ways to expose future teachers to schools earlier so that they can support classrooms and teachers. Because this is the other thing, that teachers, if they don't get equipped, they burn themselves out. And so this whole focus on discipline, it tears up students emotionally. It tears up communities, because once they're traumatized, they go into communities traumatized. If they're expelled, those communities are traumatized. And then it traumatizes teachers. Any good teacher does not want to punish a child. And if you do want to punish a child, then you don't need to be teaching. And so I do believe that there's ways to build up school students in ways that doesn't have to destroy school boards, doesn't have to destroy black teacher population, doesn't have to destroy black men and boys. There are ways to bring change without this concept that I have got to insidiously sort of make it more white in terms of culture and in terms of personnel for improvement. Because that's all that, when folks say, oh, that's not what we're doing, then I go, okay, you're data driven. Well, let's see the data. Let's see what happened in DC. Let's see what happened in Newark. Let's see what happened in New Orleans. Let's see a wholesale this movement, like 20, 30, 40% reductions in black staff to replace them with unproven people. If there was ever a blatant case of bias, oh man, that is it. So for me, yeah, I believe in school reform, but social justice is more about empowering people, not punishing them, which the modern day reform movement has no real, research is part to blame, because while we've advanced the ways we can show disparities between blacks and white people, we reinforce a deficit model, which says, hey, white students are over here, so black students have to catch up, as if white folks got it right. No, and I really do mean this. This goes to the social emotional learning stuff. The number one problem in schools is the lack of a sense of democracy in schools. I mean, and it is apparent right now, hyper-balkanization, this dismissal of democratic traditions and practices, literally the new marching, torch-tearing racists in cities. And we're talking about math improvement. I'm sorry, those same people have those same, the people who are now running schools are the same good, upright citizens you see, and this is it, go to New Orleans, look at the Confederate supporter, sympathizer in New Orleans that was marching with Confederates. But you don't have to be that explicit. There's so many teachers, so many educators, so many reformers with this deficit perspective that if we can only improve black children, if we could only fix black children, that is not the problem. Fix what's holding folks back. And there are structures in place. The way we fund education, special ed issues, discipline, these are much more fundamental. It's not whether we should charter. I mean, and I don't mean this flippantly, but after 20, 30 years of doing charter research, the best we can say is the research is mixed. Or we can say, under certain circumstances, they can work. Well, under certain circumstances, anything can work. And so, for me, we don't address the deeper racism that is occurring in schools. And we'll transition, but my kid goes to DCPS, a school in DCPS, but guess what? It's in DuPont Circle. I live in DuPont Circle, right? Nobody's complaining about the structure of a traditional school there. Nobody. Because we know that the power of class, access, literally they can come. I mean, I bring some of the kids to the Brookings Institution, let them meet scholars, let them, other than myself, have them talk to people of influence. Nobody's deriding the public school structure there. But I will say that you can go to Anacostia and you can find communities without libraries, without Brookings institutions, without jobs, without grocery stores, without sidewalks, basic amenities, basic. So for me, if we're not dealing with these underlying structural issues, basic things, you can keep reforming schools and getting what you continuously get, quote unquote mixed results, which is, being generous in the grand scheme of things.
I think we will just for a couple minutes, and depends on how things go. We'll attempt to take some questions from people. I'll repeat what you say. Is Ryan? Yes, Ryan's coming with a microphone.
I hope you don't mind if I challenge you a little bit.
That's what we're here for.
So, in the suburban or private schools, kids are expelled.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
They, so that just doesn't fly in my mind, that argument. The other thing is, everyone in this room wants things to work for our kids. It's about our children and MPS often, and charter, and choice, I guess. Mm-hmm. But what happens when you've got a teacher who's been teaching in the city for 5 years? She is totally committed to this, totally. She's white. Mm-hmm. She's my daughter-in-law. And she gets in the middle of a fight to help these students break up and appropriately find other venues to express their anger. Mm-hmm. And she's punched in the face, and her eye is affected, and she leaves the city schools because of that. She's got trauma. Mm-hmm. So tell me, because we're all practically trying to address these things, until we understand how to deal with poverty and racism, and our track record is not good, what do we do for the idealistic teachers in this room, no doubt, right, who have to deal with these things, really tough stuff, day to day? That's my question.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that they are suspending and expelling children in suburban schools. But the rates, the black rates obviously are higher, but low-income kids in general get pushed out of suburban schools. But this is the thing, and I don't want to be insensitive, but these kids are getting punched, teachers are getting punched. We've got to figure, I do know that the answer isn't suspension. I do know that at some point that kid has to learn appropriate behavior. I also believe that oftentimes teachers, their curriculums could have diffused or may have even created that situation. I mean, and I can't say this enough. There are classrooms where you don't see these problems. That kids come out of classrooms relaxed, ready to learn, and there are others that the entire school is about punishment. And we teach that to our children. And so when they end up punishing a teacher, we should not be surprised. If we walk in the shoes of a kid, literally, they are policed on their way to school. They're policed in school. They might be policed at home. Every turn is harsh. And so, yeah, I want to see less trauma in schools. But the way that you correct that is by being more nurturing, by being more loving.
One other question, briefly. I think if you press down on that, the rim of that thing, I think that'll work.
Does that work? Oh, neat.
I don't know.
So I think that this relates to that question. There is presumably a difference in strategy between what you do at a systemic level and what you do at the ground level, because kids don't enter a classroom with a blank slate. A kid who's entering in fifth grade likely has had years of bad experiences that have informed the kind of student that they are when they enter an idealistic teacher's classroom. I do believe that, while, yes, there's major systemic issues that need to be addressed, and we won't make meaningful progress until then, at the ground level, with a history of high-stakes testing, with highly academically driven teacher training, with pretty authoritative management styles and training. What can teachers do? I mean, I think teachers feel a lot of pressure that they have to deliver on the academic results, and they do. But how at the ground level, what should school leaders be saying? Yes, your test scores matter. Yes, student achievement matters. This also matters to an equal degree. I don't pretend to believe that we know yet how to measure the things that we know also matter in SEL. But what could those things be? How can teachers feel confident that I'm robbing from class attention paid on this goal to put into that goal because it matters too, and my school leaders support that.
Right,
What would you call that?
Well, but on the very grassroots, I really believe that the accountability in general, since No Child Left Behind, has really led education astray in this regard. That we use data to adjust teaching, to adjust processes. As soon as we infuse consequences to it, you corrupt the data itself. Two, you create this system that there's no real positive ending to it. You're essentially going to figure out ways to get a metric. And we know, and for roughly 40 years, 50 years of ed statistics, the top 5 predictors of academic achievement have been pretty rock solid. Income, well, prior testing, prior achievement. Income, wealth, parent educational levels, these things. Yet we never touch them. And we keep acquiescing to, we can keep getting this right. And I'm like, no, this teachers acquiesce every day. I didn't encourage my teachers that wasn't there at the time, the test out movement. But I can understand why. Because if you really want radical change, it's not going to come from a test score. Testing is a part of the structural problem that we see. And for me, revolution means challenging that structure. And you can do that in a classroom setting. You can say, teach kids why testing may harm them. Why not?
We're going to stop here and for something slightly different. I expect. We're going to switch over to our second team here. Mike Goucher is the Distinguished Fellow in Law and Public Policy here at the law school, and he will be talking with Chester E. Finn Jr., who has been on the education scene for many years.
A century at least.
A century at least. Has been the president and is founder, correct to say, of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute in Washington. Is a fellow of the Stanford, the Hoover Institution at Stanford, author of something like 20 books. Was in the Reagan administration as an assistant secretary of education. Was a policy director, is that the correct name? Legislative director for Senator Daniel P. Moynihan, going back a ways.
A ways.
And
all right,
is an extremely knowledgeable person. I'm a senior fellow here. Mike's a distinguished fellow. Checker Finn is the senior distinguished fellow, the distinguished senior fellow.
Distinguished senior, please.
Yes, so
Let's get these adjectives right.
Anyway,
all right.
Take it away.
Thank you.
Great. Checker Finn, first of all, thanks for being with us
Thanks
today.
for having me.
So I want to spend a little time at the beginning of this conversation talking about social emotional learning. We'll then broaden it for the latter part of the conversation, and I'll try and leave about 10 minutes for you to ask some questions. And then, as Alan mentioned, we will bring Andre Perry back here with Checker Finn and the two of them, and Alan will have a moderated conversation, and again, we'll take more of your questions. So let's talk a bit about social emotional learning. You got a lot of people's attention in June when you wrote a piece for Education Week, And you basically were the contrarian. You were not a fan of social emotional learning. Can you tell us, for those who are not familiar with the piece, tell us what you said and why?
Sure. Let me first say that I think good schools have always engaged in social and emotional learning along with academic learning. I am not an opponent of social emotional learning. I think, however, that the modern fad to make social emotional learning a kind of almost an alternative focus to academic learning, and to treat it as if it were adding an algebra course. Let's add social emotional learning to our curriculum. I think this is nuts. But what really got my attention was an article in a British newspaper which revealed...
The Guardian.
The Guardian, thank you. Revealed finally, after 25 years later, that the whole self-esteem movement that had been such a big deal around 1990 was in fact based on an academic hoax. That the research underlying the so-called self-esteem movement, which all came out of California, of course, was fraudulent and had been misrepresented by the late state legislator John Vasconcellos as if it really mattered, and it wasn't true. And a whole bunch of Berkeley professors had done research that had then been misrepresented. And I was worried that we were going to turn social emotional learning into the same kind of sort of fraudulent fad that self-esteem had been. What we learned about self-esteem was American kids are awash in self-esteem, but they're not awash in knowledge or skills. In marked contrast, for example, to Asian kids who are a little tentative on the self-esteem front, but do really well when it comes to learning things that make for a successful life on the skills and knowledge front. So anyway, I thought that we might alert ourselves to the possibility that social emotional learning could go the way of self-esteem, and that we should take pains that it not do so. Of course, let's have good schools engage in the emotional and social well-being of children, as I believe the good schools have always done. But that isn't something you can just inject into a school. Any more than you can just inject a culture of high achievement into a school. It sort of comes with the territory. It's there. It's there if you're lucky. I'm not sure quite how you add it on.
You've said that you like some of what is talked about
Sure.
in social emotional learning, but you think there are certain qualities or traits that are missing from that instruction.
Yeah, if you look at the website of the main advocacy group for social emotional learning, which is called KSEL, and you go down the list of qualities that they seem to think are essential elements of social emotional learning, there's some really important missing elements, and they are most of the traditional character virtues. They are things like integrity and reliability and stick-to-itiveness and courage and decency. And they're not there. Other things are there that get a lot closer to self-esteem. So I'm not sure we've got this well defined. I'm not sure we've got this well articulated. I think we might be leaving behind some of the essential elements of character development, and that we haven't been doing a very good job of in this country at all. And I think we might be edging closer to the sort of self-esteem, feel-good stuff. I think that the biggest single problem, and here I am going to disagree with Andre, the biggest single problem facing American education is our kids aren't learning nearly enough. I think that is evident from every metric I know. Whether it is college readiness to how we compare with Singapore and Switzerland on international assessments. I think it is a matter of concern for the nation's well-being going forward. I think it is a matter of concern for communities' well-being going forward. I think that is the problem that needs solving. And yes, in order to solve this problem of academic achievement and the upward mobility that I continue to believe follows from it, for kids of all kinds. Of course, kids need to be at ease, but they need to be motivated. and they need to want to learn, and they also need to want to succeed. They also need to be not fearful and nervous and antsy about what's going on in their lives or at home or in their classroom. So good schools worry about these things, and good schools deal with these things. We don't have enough good schools.
I want to come back to your point of whether or not our kids are learning enough. But I do want to pursue this a bit further. There might be the argument, I think some people who believe strongly in social emotional learning would make this argument, that if you don't address some of the issues that kids face when they walk into your classroom, based on what their lives have experienced, based on perhaps the trauma they have seen or witnessed or been a part of, if you don't spend a significant amount of time addressing that within the course of a day, it's hard to achieve the learning that you talk about. What do you say to people who make that argument?
I certainly agree that a traumatized child is not going to learn very much algebra. That almost goes without saying. I worry a lot about the tendency in this country to turn over to the schools the solution to every problem that besets the country. We keep within the 6-hour day and the 180-day year, which, damn it, hasn't changed nearly enough over the last century. We keep saying, now let's have schools deal with drug abuse. Let's have them deal with obesity. Let's have them deal with sex education. Let's have them deal with everything that plagues the country. We say now the schools should fix it in the same 6-hour day in which we also want them to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is just idiotic. It is also idiotic to expect schools to solve the problem of the traumatized child, where things are going on at home or in the neighborhood or in other aspects of their life that are not taking place within the 6 hours of school. They're taking place in the 18 hours of not school. We cannot honestly expect schools to compensate in their 6 for what happens during the 18. We just can't. And it's actually misleading and ultimately harmful because it sort of gets everybody else off the hook. Well, schools are going to deal with the problem of the traumatized child. So does that mean that we stop worrying about the issues that led to the trauma in the first place, which are not in the control of the schools? Why is the child traumatized for reasons schools cannot control? They're pretty good when they're good at teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're not very good at healing troubled neighborhoods or broken families, or community violence. It's not within their capacity. Other institutions of society need to deal with the things that lead to the trauma that leads to the kid coming to school traumatized. Yes, teachers have to deal with the traumatized child. They cannot solve the sources of the trauma.
So back to your point on whether our kids are learning enough, given some of the realities that exist in our world today in terms of where kids grow up and what they experience, so how do we increase the amount they learn? What works?
Well, the really good charter schools, and I've become a fan of the really good ones, and there are a bunch of them in our 7,000 charter schools in the United States, have in fact expanded the school day and school week and school year in order to encompass a larger fraction of the kid's life. And that is both to deal with more elements of the kid's life, but it's also to deal with more learning. Start younger, go longer, work harder, be nice. I think I'm sort of mimicking the KIPP motto, actually, here. And I think that, so we do need to start younger, go longer, work harder, have higher standards, have expectations, have accountability for outcomes. I think I'm going to disagree with Andre on this one. And have good teachers working on a very strong curriculum. An aligned curriculum that is standards-based and that is well taught and that is to the degree we're able to personalized so that kids can, excuse me, I've had a cough for 4 days.
It's that time of year. It is.
That enables kids to the maximum extent to move at their own speed with all the encouragement that they can. A lot of kids can learn a lot more than they're learning. My own sort of personal anecdote is 3 granddaughters going to very expensive private schools in DC and New York, very nice progressive schools in which everybody is nice and tolerant and caring and loving and diverse. Kids aren't learning nearly enough, and they're bored because the school is not focusing enough on maximizing the academic learning of the kids in it. This we can do more about. We should do more about, and kids should be moving as fast as they can through a solid curriculum.
Speaking of solid curriculum, the Fordham Institute, your organization, was a strong supporter of Common Core. Which
Yes.
was
And other good high academic standards.
yes, and you were trying to get some sort of way to have a curriculum that everybody used. Fair, I don't want to overstate
Going
that.
to take her cough drop.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
You know, that you were trying to get some consistency in terms of what kids are taught.
Yeah.
And then you could measure it in some way. So what has Common Core accomplished? What has happened to it? How do you feel about it today?
Common Core is part of a movement to raise academic standards. And on the whole, states have raised their academic standards, whether they call it Common Core or call it something else, or call it Common Core with a new face, or do something else instead of Common Core. States have higher academic standards than they did 20 years ago. This is a good thing. Most of them also have better tests than they had 20 years ago, aligned with the standards that they've got. Now, what comes of all that depends, of course, on what happens in the schools, on whether there is a meaningful accountability system in place, on whether everything else is aligned with the standards, the teacher preparation, the actual curriculum itself. Lots of other things have to be aligned in order for the standards to make any difference. Standards don't teach anybody anything. And tests don't teach anybody anything. They're just a dipstick, a thermometer that tells whether something happened. The something happening still depends on what happens in the classroom, in the homework, in the teacher preparation, in the teacher evaluation, in the choice of textbooks, in the technology, in the school leadership, in the school climate. All of these elements, it really is a complicated system. And it's got to be pretty well aligned in order for those standards to matter. But we do have better standards than we had. And there have been some gains. Poor and minority kids are doing better in the early grades especially, on metrics like the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Not nearly well enough. And 12th grade is largely flat. And if you look at things like PISA, other countries are moving ahead faster than we are. And I think that's something the country should be worried about. But we've been making some gains.
How do you feel about testing? Are we, there are probably people sitting in this room who feel that we are testing way too much, that that's the measurement of success for a child. How do you feel about that?
Well, it is a thermometer. It's not the only diagnostic instrument you would want your doctor to use is a thermometer, or just a blood pressure. You want them to use a lot of things. And you also want them to look at, to see whether you look healthy and whether you can walk straight and whether you slur your speech if you've got cough drops in your mouth and things like that. So we've come to rely an awful lot on testing in this country because it is quantifiable, it is comparable, measurable, and is relatively efficient and more or less stands up in court. It looks objective. It looks like something you can kind of count on, as opposed to somebody's subjective judgment like a teacher's grade. And we also know that teacher grades have been rising faster than test scores have been rising. We do have an issue of grade inflation in this country. We do have an issue of needing external metrics of some kind about whether learning is taking place. And we've come to rely overmuch on testing. We don't do things like they do in England with a school inspectorate, where knowledgeable people come around and spend several days in the school, essentially taking its temperature and its blood pressure and looking at its eyes and writing a report on how's the school functioning? Is it working well? Do the kids seem to be learning things? And do they seem to be learning the things that tests don't really show you, of which there are a great many? So testing is, I think, it's not going away. You can wish it away, you can opt your kid out of it, but it's not going away. It's embedded in federal law, it's embedded in state law, it's here to stay. The question is, do we have too many overlapping and redundant tests? Yes. Many of them turn out to be state and local tests, not the federally mandated kind. Are we looking at enough other stuff besides test scores? That's probably my phone, I apologize.
I have to say, though, of all the ringtones, that's my favorite. It really is good.
Somebody,
Fan of the blues. There you go.
Thank
right
you.
there.
Thank you, Andre. Somebody's been monitoring what I'm saying, and they were calling to say I was off script, I think. Sorry about that.
You have often been referred to as an education reformer. You spoke a few minutes ago of your appreciation for the contributions of charter schools that have high standards and high quality. But one thing that, besides more testing, one thing we have seen is this proliferation of charter schools, voucher schools, in addition to...
You got a full share of them here.
We do. We have, as people say, we have an ecosystem that features 3 different sectors in many respects. What difference has that really made?
I've come to believe in school choice as a basic principle on the grounds that people should not be confined in a school against their wishes. People especially should not be confined in a bad school against their wishes if there's a better school down the street. And in order to get to that point, you have to have alternatives to the school you are confined in. And this leads you to, I think, a fundamental point of freedom, just as we have freedom to pick our church and our college and our restaurant and our movies. We should be able to pick our schools. They should all have to have certain standards of quality and performance. And they should all be accountable in some way, I think, not just to the marketplace, but to those who care about the future of society. But I do think that having choices is a fundamental, ought to be a fundamental right of every American. And of course, upper middle class families have choices, and often good ones. I think the big challenge is getting good choices available to more people who haven't had them in the past. And vouchers and charters aren't the only way to do this. Other districts can do this within the traditional framework if they allow school diversity and choice to occur. States can do this by allowing, I think Wisconsin's done this, allowing kids to go to schools in other districts and not just the one they live in. I do believe that the 2 big changes that have come over American education in my lifetime, really, one is we now judge schools by their results, not by their inputs. And the other is we no longer assume that you have to go to the district-operated cookie-cutter neighborhood school where you live. I think those are 2 profound and I think desirable changes in American education.
Why do you think we haven't made more progress, though, in terms of we've created these alternative models? Why have we not been able to do better?
Some of them are really crappy schools. I mean,
what do we do about those schools?
We shouldn't have allowed them to start in the first place, probably. We shouldn't keep them open in the second place. It's hard, however, everybody knows this, to close a bad school. People love their bad school. People love their bad school. And sometimes, sadly, the alternatives to that bad school aren't actually any better than the bad school. That's a crime, but it's a reality. Fordham Institute is an authorizer of charter schools in Ohio, actually. And we have 11, 12, I think now, charter schools in our portfolio. And when we're faced, we've got some terrific schools in that group, but we also have some mediocre ones. And charter school doctrine says if you've got a school that's not measuring up, you should close it. Easy doctrine. Where the rubber hits the road is you look around at the 342 kids in that mediocre school and you say, if we were to close that school, where would they go? And what if it turns out that the alternatives available to those kids in that community are worse than your mediocre charter school, which is at least safe and welcoming and rudimentary skills are being learned there. That's not enough to suit me or to suit us as an authorizer. But if you look around, and the alternatives available to those kids from that mediocre charter school are, let's say, dangerous places, places where no learning is taking place, places that are hostile to one kind of kid or another. You don't just randomly close that mediocre school, even though the doctrine says you should. This is a real dilemma. It's a moral dilemma as well as an education policy dilemma. And it's similar to the kind that districts face when they have mediocre schools or bad schools, that they ought to, if not close, they ought to at least transform. They ought to sort of start over again in that building. And that happens sometimes. And why haven't we made more progress? Partly we've got a huge amount of adult interests invested in the system as it is. We make an awful lot of decisions to please the adult interests in the system. I'm going to mention, but not focus exclusively on teacher unions. They're probably the most visible of the adult interests, but there are 30 adult interests that don't really want to change things very much. For my sins, I am now on the State Board of Education in Maryland. And we have seen the adult interests swoop down on the legislature and insist on laws being passed that make it impossible to make big changes in even awful schools in inner city Baltimore. Now, the kinds of changes that I think the State Board would like to make are probably the kind Andre doesn't think should be made by outside people. But I think they're necessary, but we're not allowed to make them because the state legislature, in the hands of the adult interests, won't let us. Add to that suburban complacency with the performance of the schools today. Millions and millions of Americans think their kid's school is okay. And if they think it's okay, they don't want it to change very much. And the heck with those scores from Singapore. My kid's going to a good school. Or my kid's going to the kind of school I went to, and therefore must be a good school. Or my kid's going to the school into whose neighborhood we moved because we think it's a good school, and we're darned if we're going to show buyer's remorse about the house we bought by criticizing the school. No, that's why we moved here. There's a lot of complacency. So put together adult interests, middle-class complacency, and a very tight limits on the length and school day and the school year and stuff like that. And then the serious challenges that a lot of kids start with. I mean, the kids who enter kindergarten having basically never been read to, and therefore are going to have a whole lot more trouble with early language arts than the kids who arrive with 60,000 words in their background. We're not making enough progress.
Andre will be coming up in a few minutes, and we'll let the two of you talk about some of these things. But I do want to go back to something that he mentioned in his remarks earlier with Alan. And this is whether or not the progress we've made is related to what he talked about, whether this is really an issue of structural racism, whether this is an issue of factors that we as citizens still have not confronted or dealt with. What do you think of that?
I'm certainly not going to deny the issues that racism poses for American society and for black and brown people in particular. But I also think there's a great deal that schools can do to foster upward mobility among kids from those communities and kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think our very best schools do that and have always done that, and we don't have nearly enough of them. And I think that getting a kid from a disadvantaged background, however you define disadvantaged, up to and through college and out with a college degree is still probably the closest thing there is for that kid to a ticket to mainstream America and middle-class life. Maybe suburban complacency, that comes later. But let's at least give them the option of that. And good schools can do a great deal to bring that about. And in spite of
the kinds of obstacles that the society faces, and the divisions among us, and the political schisms that we have. Mention in passing that occurred to me this morning that some of our fascination with social emotional learning might have to do with the fact that we see it so absent from so many prominent public figures. Clearly, therefore, I think we better do something about that for the next generation, and probably should. But we can do a lot in spite of, or while we're trying to address these other broader issues.
So that leads me, you actually brought me to a final question before we take audience questions. So what impact do you think that President Trump, Education Secretary DeVos, will have on education in this country?
Not much.
Why do you say that?
Federal government really doesn't have that much to do.
You know that from personal experience, or?
Well, I know from a long stint in the U.S. Department of Education that the federal government doesn't have all that much effect on what happens in schools. It supplies about 10% of the money. It probably makes about 15% of the rules. It does not set the curriculum. It does not hire the teachers. It does not confer diplomas. It does not select textbooks. It does not do any of the things that ultimately decide whether a given kid is going to a good school or learning in a classroom. The federal government does, when it's working well, some useful things like statistics and research and civil rights enforcement, and it moves some money around. Adding some to disadvantaged schools. And it sometimes creates incentives for various reforms that some people like and other people don't like. But it's not the key player. And at the moment, I think that's probably a good thing. But it is not the key player. Now, with the federal Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the successor to the much lamented No Child Left Behind Act, actually returns quite a lot of authority to the state. We've been struggling with that on the Maryland State Board of Education. I read in the newspaper, you've been struggling with that a bit in Wisconsin even. But it does mean that the federal role is less in the next 5 years than it was in the last 5 years. As I said, that's probably a good thing. I'm not even going to get onto the topic of Secretary DeVos. We could talk about her for the next hour or so.
Another program. Let's take
Invite her.
We're going to take some audience questions, because Checker Finn said he really wants audience questions, so he's looking forward to that.
Well, I said it was cruel to audiences not to give them a chance.
I agree with that. So if you're seated down here in the seating bowl, please press down on the rim, not on the ball. Keep your finger down on the rim. We'll be able to hear your question. We're going to be replacing these, so we're going to make it much easier for you in the future. And then if you're in the back, please wait for Ryan. He'll come by and hold a microphone in front of you. All we ask is that you keep your questions brief, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. You have a question? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. With Milwaukee as a case in point, it's taken us several generations to sink to the low scores that we're now producing. If everything was determined today to be turned around and plans were set in place, when might we expect to actually see real improvement?
Well, education is not like making a souffle. You don't see the results rise in your oven in the next 11 minutes while you look through the window of the oven. Kids really do take 18 years to get to age 18. And I don't think we can do anything about that. We can start younger with kids. We can go longer. We can intensify and accelerate. But one of the reasons that some of the smartest charter school starters in the country only want to start with kindergarten and first grade and add a grade a year is because they want to grow their own kids basically up through their own system, because they've learned that taking in a 14-year-old who's had 7 or 8 lousy years of schooling beforehand is really, really, really hard to repair. And so I think that a start over again situation in a major bureaucratic school system is going to take a while. The places that have accomplished anything educationally, Massachusetts is a good case in point, have stuck to their guns and stayed on course for a decade or 15 years. They haven't switched strategies. They haven't oscillated from one reform to another. They haven't. They've typically even been bipartisan, so that an election didn't change the course of the reform that much. It takes a while. It takes persistence. It takes stick-to-itiveness, and it takes some degree of consensus between the powers that be, so that after the next election, you're not trying to sweep out the last reform and the last group of people and put in another one.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes, sir. Dean Hank.
Dr. Finn, I was wondering, are there any aspects of social and emotional learning that you think deserve intentional attention in schools?
Sure. But many of them are things, as I said at the outset, that good schools have always have always done. Is this child, thanks again, getting cough drops and water from all sides. Is this child a emotionally functioning human being as opposed to an agitated, nervous, fearful person? Is this child got a sense of self that is sufficient to have a purpose and a rationale for why they're in school and what they're doing here, and why learning is something they ought to be doing? I mean, there are a bunch of things having, and of course, how is this child treating other children and teachers and people in the immediate environment? I mean, I've come to believe that that studious kids and teachers have a right to a safe and tranquil learning environment. And I tend to worry in the case of a disrupted classroom about the good kids and what's happening to their education in that classroom. And so, yeah, the interactions of people with other people matter profoundly in any group setting, and that certainly includes classrooms and schools. So, yeah. But I want to repeat, these are things that good schools have always, and good teachers have always focused on. Isn't something we need to or know how to inject like a syringe into a curriculum. It's more like what's modeled, what's the culture of the school, what's the modeling of the role modeling by the adults in the school. What are the ways in which people in the school relate to one another, starting at the top, incidentally. These are more important than the formal curriculum when it comes to social emotional learning by the children.
Let's take maybe one more question, or we can actually move to the next part of our program.
At least one back there.
Back here? Oh, okay. Sorry, hang on a second.
Hi there. Oh my goodness. So new teachers and principals alike will talk a lot about challenges with classroom management.
Yes. Always have.
I think we really disagree globally about what that means for teachers, because it seems to describe a certain alchemy that quote-unquote good teachers, which I believe can be trained and aren't born, but that good people who are effective with children are doing a lot of things right at the same time. Mm-hmm. They're perhaps being supported by their principals. They're perhaps effective in creating relationships with children who have very different lived experiences than their own. Mm-hmm. This kind of things that good teachers have always done is very challenging, I think, for me when we're trying to prepare people to have effective management skills that support children in very, very challenging community and lived experiences. So I don't know if you've been a teacher, but either speaking from your perspective on what that might look like, because it seems like that amorphous concept of classroom management might get at some of this for those of us who work in schools.
That's an important question, and it goes to teacher selection, preparation, induction, supervision, mentoring, all those other things. And I think I just mentioned at least 5 things, each of which has needs its own paragraph or page. and they need to integrate with each other. And so I don't think I can give a glib answer to your absolutely correct point, which is that when I say good teachers have always done these things, it has been a lot of things coming together for those teachers in those classrooms, and they have acquired those capacities in various ways. And not necessarily from their ed school, maybe from what happened to them in their first year or 2 or 3 of teaching, maybe with the right kind of colleagues and mentors and preceptors and principals. I don't think I'm going to be able, in short compass, to say how to do it. It needs to be done. And to those of you here who prepare teachers, please do it.
You were a high school teacher, were you not, at one
Yes.
time? Yes.
And then a university professor.
Right, at Vanderbilt. Anybody else here? Or what I'll do is I'll wrap this part of it up. I'll bring Alan back. We'll bring Andre Perry back up here. I'll step aside. Again, thank you to Checker Finn. Thank you very
Mike.
much.
Yes.
This actually just came up kind of at the last minute, the notion of why aren't we having the two of them talking together and some dialogue. Let me bounce a couple terms off of you, and eager to get your reaction to them. One is culturally appropriate education. You want to start, Andre?
Oh, I think it involves the what I would consider authentic teaching and learning, where the students and the teachers are generally in sync with each other in terms of purpose, why they're there, what they're learning. And, you know, I mean, to put it, I mean, we typically think of culturally appropriate learning as that you're not imposing value or making value judgments in terms of your teaching, in terms of the curriculum on the students, and they understand. I generally say it's when people are in sync with one another in general.
Do we have too many schools or too many kids getting culturally inappropriate education these days?
Well, we have too many kids getting inappropriate education. I think teachers should make value judgments about a lot of things, like the difference between good and evil, and courage and cowardice. And I mean, if the story that the kids are reading has a moral lesson in it, the teacher should help draw that lesson out. And if you refrain from all value judgments, you refrain from part of what you're supposed to be doing, as a teacher. The other element to culturally appropriate often is this education appropriate for kids from this particular background versus kids from this other particular background. And there's some important sensitivities here, but I also think it's important for kids to learn a lot of stuff in common with each other. I mean, that's part of the theory behind the Common Core, for example, or behind state standards, is that regardless of background, there are a lot of things that people in this country have in common, that people in the state or community have in common, and that they all ought to learn. And I guess I focus more on that part of education, frankly, than on the differences parts.
This is where, you know, where the controversy is. In terms of school program, I think we all know now that walking on white lines is culturally inappropriate. Reason being that walking on white lines, broken windows theories, and all of that were generally derived, and as it manifests itself in schools, were generally derived from a set of criminal justice reforms. And so you see white lines in prisons, and you see sort of 3 strikes in schools, when it had no sense being in and outside of it. You now see it in schools. And so, and you see it in the way, the examples you use in terms of math, science, history. I mean, history is a big one. That we are not valuing the students and what they bring to the table. It's too often, I need to show you the right way in doing things when it comes to black and brown children. And that is the problem, because once you set up these cultural, you're never going to teach people you really don't value well, or you're not going to maximize their opportunity. When I can see myself in basic lessons, it is much easier for me to learn it and much easier for me to promote it. But if you're constantly saying to a child in different ways, no, your way is wrong, let me show you, then you're going to minimize the impact of that lesson.
Another term, and it comes up often in the context of talking about social and emotional needs of kids, is trauma-informed education. That so many kids come to school with major traumas in their lives, this whole ACEs index of have you been through these highly stress-inducing things in early childhood? Mm-hmm. What is that? What's your reaction to that term? We'll start with Checker this time.
Well, as I said a little earlier, I think that schools and teachers need to do their best to help kids cope with traumas in their life, whether it's that they didn't get breakfast, or they've got a parasite, or they've got a beating. But the schools are not gonna either be able to remove the causes, the sources of those traumas, nor can the coping with the trauma completely take over the entire work of the school. So it's one of the reasons we also have school social workers and psychologists and other people in many schools that are meant to help with these special situations. I hope they're special. If they're widespread, then we need more help. So yeah, it's a job. It's an inescapable obligation of schools, just like feeding lunch. But it isn't the whole job of schools either.
You know, I'm more interested in how curriculums cause trauma. You know, I agree with Checker in a sense of academic, social, emotional. I mean, I get frustrated because it's all learning. You know, we've broken up learning into all these discrete buckets that really don't reflect how we live. All learning is social emotional, all learning is academic. I mean, you can't separate these things. But what we can see in schools is that you can cause harm by having a quote unquote good curriculum upon another person if it's not culturally appropriate. You know, I mean, the obvious, if you, I mean, you know, it should be harmful for us all. But for indigenous people of this land to constantly hear about Christopher Columbus and his wonderful offerings to the world is an affront to who you are. The same way but we do that insidiously in the way teachers present themselves to students. So schools, trauma is just but not just about fighting. It's not just about, I mean, it's also about but not just about your father being incarcerated. It is also about many lessons, many curriculums are an affront to folks in the classroom. So they should not be. High schools should feel more like preschool in this regard. Like, I don't know where the whole care thing got out of schools, that in order to be an effective teacher, you got to be mean. I don't know where that came from, but
don't smile till Thanksgiving.
Exactly.
I heard very different sentiments from each of you this morning about the promise or potential of getting education. Checker was saying that the biggest ticket out of being in the bottom bracket of the socioeconomic ladder is a college degree. You were saying for a lot of black kids, maybe it applies to other minorities as well, I would think it does, they're just not getting ahead. High school diploma for a white kid a white adult and that getting a degree, getting a diploma isn't going to get you out of that. What is the promise? Two questions. One is, go over that. What is the promise and potential of getting a good education? And if I may, take the other side, each of you. Why should you get a good education? Why haven't things gotten better for people who've gotten education who are coming from low-income backgrounds? Andre, you go first this time.
Oh, we need better schools because we need white people to be less racist. I mean, and I'll go back to me because it's hard not being me. But black folk are not the problem, and they don't need to be fixed. They're not held back by themselves. But my point is, there are people who, many of whom are in this room, when you look at investment, and this is my thing, I believe you are what you invest in. That you'll have black school leader over here, white school leader over here. Oh, the promises of KIPP. I'm giving you tons of money. Oh, the Joe Blow, the Malcolm Jamal Warner Academy of the Arts, right? Here, I'll give you pennies. So for me, they can do the exact same thing. But the root of inequality has something to do with the lack of value and investment in black people. That to me is the problem, not the reform.
Is it a good message to tell African American children, we're going to college? I mean, I go to schools where they've got banners up in kindergarten rooms for where the teacher went to college.
Sometimes it says Marquette.
Yeah. Well, that could work.
Exactly.
And is that a good message to give to black kids? Is it a good promise to make to them?
Of course. I
got the feeling you were dubious about that.
No, but I've always said it's not about a degree, it's what you do with it. And it's not about saying that Harvard and Princeton is better. It's about providing a curriculum that can give folks an opportunity to self-determine. I want college. I want people with degrees. I believe in sort of this, philosopher king society where we're thinking individuals. But by no means am I saying go to college so you can be like this white person. It is about getting an education so that we can all figure this out. And I just want to be clear about this. Many white folks go to college not because they're talented. The reason why people go to college, to Harvard, to Princeton, to Yale, is not solely because of their smarts. Give black communities those things. I will gladly take jobs, proper housing, safe streets, instead of Common Core. I mean, it's important. And again, I'm actually a proponent of Common Core. But it's not the root of why folks aren't getting into elite colleges. It's not.
Your response to that, and part of that is, why haven't things gotten better when that message has been out there for so long now to get a college degree and get ahead in life?
I'm not, in general, a huge fan of paper credentials as opposed to actual performance in life. But I do think that these diplomas and degrees have some significance in contemporary America. They come with two problems. One is that they are not all of equal value. A kid with a diploma from one school has learned a whole lot more than a kid with a diploma from another school. And very often, which school that is correlates with family background. There's no doubt about that. And the other issue, which I think Andre's alluded to several times, is that even people coming out with the identical credential from the identical school don't always get the same breaks and opportunities in life once they've got it. And that's for a whole host of other reasons, some of which include discrimination and racism, some of which include unequal job openings in one community versus another. I mean, there are a bunch of reasons for this. So the credentials are not of equal value, and even when they are sort of nominally of equal value, they don't always get the same rewards. Nevertheless, a pretty good ticket out of poverty is a college diploma. And we can argue about which kind of diploma in what subject from which school. Some two-year degrees actually earn more than some four-year degrees, stuff like that. But a pretty good ticket out of poverty is a college degree. And usually that has to start with a high school diploma.
But we keep promoting this idea of this American dream, that if you can only go to school, you can overcome everything. That is a falsehood. I mean, I just want to be clear about when you're talking about elite colleges and universities, there are only so many slots. And upper middle class people are fighting tooth and nail for those slots. This is not you can go anywhere and be anything. So for me, it's about understanding education is important. You need to go to college. More importantly, you need to learn something substantive to be able to navigate your world. But when you get that education, you realize that we've been promoting this myth of what education can do at the expense of doing things to make that dream a reality. Like, we still need, and education can be a part of it, but we're not giving place-based scholarships to people from certain areas of the community to go to college for free, when we should be able to do that, when we know debt is crippling low-income families. We're not dismantling a criminal justice system that we know is robbing resources, energy, and talent from our schools. We're not doing major things. What we will do is fire a bunch of teachers, expel a bunch of kids, and things that just, according to the research, provide no significant gain, like none. So for me, governance has never been in the top in terms of schools, top anything in terms of predicting for academic success. But if we can only get rid of these school boards, for me, it's like, man, there is a reason why we do not want to address issues around race and class.
I'm going to disagree a little bit on 2 points. One is issues like reforming criminal justice system, which urgently need attention, are not within the purview of the education system. They require another approach. I don't think that's K-12 policy. The other point just slipped out of my head, so it'll come back.
But my point is, but the governance, would you agree?
Yes.
That there is a school to prison pipeline?
Yes, there is.
Right.
But it isn't just the fault of the schools. It arises from a whole bunch of other circumstances. No, on governance, here I really do disagree with one important point. I think that locally elected school boards are at the root of a lot of problems in a lot of schools that we can't solve because of those locally elected school boards that get more interested in the adult interests and the political interests of the members of the school board than the kids in the system. If I had my druthers, I would abolish most locally elected school boards and replace them with a different governance structure. I think kids would benefit. That's why.
But my point is, we get really adamant when it comes to black school districts, and we don't go after. I mean, when I was in Louisiana, I could go after almost every rural parish, every white, but yet we focused on New Orleans.
Well, they did have the hurricane.
No, but there was always an interest in New Orleans to reform New Orleans.
Because it was a horrible school system.
And there's not plenty else to go around that a white led? I mean, I just think, again, but why? I mean, there are structural reasons why, but why do we, when it comes to breaking things up, it's always on the black districts. It's about 67 to 70% of takeover stuff occur in urban black districts. There's a reason for that. That's not because, they're only of certain size, or they're only low performing. No, it's because we don't value that they can actually change a situation.
I wish you'd tell that to the Dayton School Board. They could, but they don't.
But again, this is where, for me, the reason why school districts in urban places are not achieving is not necessarily because of schools. You show me one state where low-income residents are outperforming upper-income residents. Yeah. I mean, these things are interconnected, but in one more, to understand the whole federal role. Yes, education doesn't control. But why federal policy is important is because federal policy shapes education. From redlining to the Federal Highway Administration to taxing policy, we are destroying communities through federal policy, and educators will stand back and go, well, that's not us. Let's just let that happen over there. And you see it at a state level. The criminal justice, I'm getting my funding from certain reform crowds, so I can't speak up on criminal justice reform, knowing that it's robbing of our money. So, yeah, they're different. There's different control, but educators, particularly ones focused on choice, have essentially compromised their values on every other issue impacting education by abdicating a responsibility to touch those things.
This may be the most naive question I could possibly ask, but that's me.
Naive Alan.
Yeah. Why is there such a strong correlation between income and educational success? What's the levers that make that happen? Why, if I know an income map of Wisconsin, do I know an educational success map of Wisconsin? What's the connection there? It doesn't have to be. You don't have to be rich to go to a school with no tuition, to go to the library and get books, to turn off the TV and run why?
It's worth mentioning that the connection is not as tight in many other countries as it is in the United States. Some research that a colleague and I did essentially it was on gifted education, but we were looking for the sort of correlations between socioeconomic and how many kids get into the sort of high achieving ranks on things like PISA. Every country has a correlation, but we have the biggest, the tightest. It's worth wondering why we're different from Germany or Japan or whatever, any other country you want to mention in that regard. And it's certainly been true, as I think Andre said earlier, that this has been around forever, this correlation. Income is partly the obvious stuff, that income buys you things that help you get educated, whether it's books or summer camp or field trips or a better school in a better neighborhood, stuff like that. The other is that income is a proxy for a lot of other things, like parent education and the number of other adults, programs with, whether you're also in the Girl Scouts and the Little League and all that other stuff that helps shape you as a person.
But it's also because rich people hoard goods and services. I mean, they stack the decks for them, because they have power. And so, and that's where, I'm very specific in terms of taking an asset-based approach to change. We've got to stop looking at poor people and poverty as the problem. No, there are people, I mean, and it is clear in this political environment from, you know, I don't know your political preference, but this idea that we will provide benefits to a few at the expense of a middle class and the poor is abhorrent. And in other countries, the reason why the poverty and economic and poverty and well-to-do rates are closer is because many of these countries have social safety nets that we don't. You can get free health care. You can get free higher education. We don't. And so when we always go, let's look at Finland. Well, I would love to have the social safety nets in Finland. I mean, it is not the problem of low-income schools. The problem is, why does that school not receive the resources that it needs to succeed? That's not on them. That's not on the poor folk. But yet we keep going this way. It's a logic problem. It doesn't make sense. Like if your phone went off, I didn't just say, let's cancel the call. Oh, let me put it on silent.
Appreciate that you did that, though.
So that's the sort. But when we say, why don't these districts get what they need to be successful? We keep going to the district. I'm like, okay, well, but when we talk about, and you're dealing with this right now in Maryland.
Yes.
The funding, essentially the funding structure of schools. We don't talk about the white flight that occurred in the suburbs, the redlining, the highway systems that helped create this mess.
If you talk to or listen to or read some of the character proponents, the grit and resilience and so on, one of the traits, and we've had Paul Tuff here to do a program several years ago, one of the traits that they focused on is optimism.
Mm-hmm.
Two questions about that. One is, what do you think of that notion that optimism itself is connected to, kids who have hope for their futures, they see a future for themselves. Is that a legitimate focal point? And how do you increase optimism among kids? Second, do you have any reason to be optimistic yourself about what's coming ahead, especially for higher needs communities and students? So optimism. Checker, you go
Well,
first.
optimism and related things like purposefulness and directedness and having a kind of a goal, a mission, things like that, motivation. To me, these come together, and they're very important qualities for any pursuit in sort of anything, including schooling, but certainly not just in schooling. A study came out just a few days ago that looked at compared U.S. kids and Chinese kids in terms of the degree to which they were motivated to do well. And it turned out that if you gave the U.S. kids money for completing the test, they did better on it. It turns out that if you gave Chinese kids money to complete the test, they didn't do any better. They did just as well as they would have done. Why? Because they had or at least the explanation was the Chinese kids had some intrinsic motivation to do well on this kind of thing, and the American kids needed an extrinsic motivator, or a bribe, if you want to put it really crudely, to put themselves out and try to do better. Well, that's not a good thing if you have to have if you have to have that. So yeah, the things that come with optimism, like a purpose in life, are very important. I don't know how well schools and teachers can infuse that. I don't know. As for me,
It's a really good question.
It's a really good question.
Well, no, I think I'm optimistic in a sense of I see great teachers, great leaders doing tremendous work with the tools that they are given. And you have to be optimistic. I just think that but if you're a kid, if you're an adult and you look at what folks are up against, you should be realistic. The reason why this debate about Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't know if you know this whole debate of why doesn't he promote hope? Or there has to be a hope in your message. There is sort of this wanting hope because, that there has to be a way out. No, there does not have to be. If we continue down this road with privileged people being comfortable with maintaining their privilege, we can go on and on and on and on. And it's not on them. Black folk and brown folk have hope. Like you go to the community, you're in the social networks, we find hope when there's none to be grabbed. But when we see, oh wow, you can actually become president, head of a major corporation, head of and have done all these things and still succeed. But I jaywalk, smoke weed, do this and that, go to jail for enormous amounts of years, go to a school where you're going to be punished. Yeah, I would be a little bit down. Because the hypocrisy that exists when somebody says, oh, you should have some hope. No, you have the hope. Like, you have the hope when you said that. But you should want to see real substantive change.
I'm debating whether to take a question from the audience, but it'll have to be kind of brief.
No, be brief.
Let's go to the back of the room, actually. Wait, here comes Ryan with the microphone.
Delighted with your comments. Excellent. Thank you for being here, and thank you for hosting them. Given all the knowledge you have, all the experiences and exposures you had, tell me what you think happened to this school. I'll give you some anecdotal information. I don't expect you to be right, of course. Just what do you think might have happened? Conceptually, ideas. 10,000 referrals a year, high school. 4 years later, they have 1,000. In the fall of the year, normally chaos. Tranquil hallways 6 months later. At the end of 6 years, the students in the high school are assisting the principal and the educators with more appropriate curricula to hit the students where they're learning better. What do you think happened?
I have no idea.
A better leader would be a good guess.
No change in leadership. The assistant principal became the principal, but it was the same operation. That's a good one, though.
No, you tell us.
No.
No, I can't.
It's got to be brief here, I should add.
Well, you're the facilitator. Give me, just apply the knowledge to that. You're hitting on the right stuff.
I don't want to guess. I don't want to guess.
How else will you learn?
I'd have to know the school myself.
Well,
I would agree with Chap. My first reaction, if I heard something like that, would be leadership, the principal.
But Alan knows the answer, so he should
No,
give it.
actually, I don't.
Oh.
He actually does, but he's got a lot to do up there. This was a school that chose to build a character plate that everything else rests on. And they went to a program that we have in Wisconsin called the Leadership Academy for Character and Culture. The principal and 6 of their staff went. 6 months later, they said, here we have all these other things we're responsible for, and we've got this program we're going to. We're only 6 months into a 12-month program. Which one of these are going to have a permanent impact on us as professional and last the rest of our life? And they immediately said, this leadership program and
This is where we got to always be, schools are communities. And the tighter community it is, and if it does have, good values, good, things that you would like to see and imagine a good school, that people are trusting of each other, that they're promoting.
A sound culture.
So sound culture. Yeah, so when they're tight, and sometimes that can come in the form of, like, they have a pillar of rule, like character things. When that happens, you have a solid school. I mean, so I wouldn't disagree with that.
You have it. This whole community came around the school, and the school came around the whole community with the skills they learned.
All right, now do it in about 10,000 more schools, and I'm going to be really impressed.
We've got 15 in Wisconsin that are exemplars for the rest of the state.
Okay.
We are going to stop this portion of the program at this point. I want to say two things. One is
Everybody's like, hold on, whoa.
There was a great sigh of relief in the room.
I deeply want to thank Checker Finn and Andre Perry for coming to Milwaukee to be part of this, and for their thoughtfulness and candor and provocative remarks. Second, we'll take a 15-minute break. When we come back, we will turn the focus to what's going on in Wisconsin and in the Milwaukee area, specifically on social emotional learning. We have an excellent panel. Professor Cynthia Elwood will be moderating. Karen Stoiber of UWM, Beth Herman, who's the DPI person on this, Kim Morath, who's the MPS person on this, Suzanne Breslow from the school standpoint, namely Milwaukee College Prep.
Sorry.
And
Pleasure.
we will be discussing what is actually going on in pursuit of this here and what can be learned from it. Thank you both. Thank you.
That was great.
The first two sessions, and again, I want to thank Andre Perry and Chester Finn for joining us, were certainly lively, thoughtful, provocative, but now we're going to turn the focus more directly to social and emotional learning and what is going on in our midst. I set out to find people who had different bases of interest, and on that score, I think we were successful. Let me introduce the panel briefly. At the end from where I'm standing, Professor Karen Stoiber of UWM School of Education, and she has expertise in this area and has been working, one of the things that interested me has been working with organizations such as Next Door and the Boys and Girls Clubs, dealing with these kind of issues outside of the context of K-12 education, early childhood or outside of the school day, and that certainly interests me. Beth Herman is, I forget the exact title, but basically the social emotional learning person for the DPI, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and formerly worked for MPS, correct? Yes. Kim Morath is the social and emotional lead person for Milwaukee Public Schools. And Suzanne Breslow has a title now of Culture Dean of Milwaukee College Prep, which is a network of 4 charter schools on the north side, all in low-income, high-needs communities, I might say. And as has been publicized by certain newspaper columnists, a set of schools that had extraordinary records in the state report card, partly because of their school culture. I especially want to introduce Professor Cynthia Elwood, who's frankly one of my favorite people. Was a principal in Milwaukee Public Schools, was an administrator, a high level in Milwaukee Public Schools, both in the Howard Fuller era and then later in the more recent years under Superintendent Greg Thornton and Superintendent Darian Driver, and then left and is now at the Marquette College of Education. And she is going to be our moderator with a green light to, this is really shocking to people who know her, she has some opinions also. So I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia with great thanks to the 5 of you for sharing your knowledge and thoughts.
Well, great, I get my own mic.
Okay. I want this
That's good. Yeah, I think they're all synced. It's an honor to be with you today and to be part of this panel. And I want to make apologies to the people over my shoulder here because I'll spend a lot of the time facing the panel. And so please excuse my rudeness. I was raised better. I'll do my very best to not ignore you. The second apology I want to make to start is that we may not have time for questions. With 4 people with their feet in the field up here, we have the collective goal of provoking your interest so that you will run off and find out more. But we don't believe that we can answer all your questions here this morning. So with that, I want to pose just we've heard a lot about opinions about whether socio-emotional learning should be part of the curriculum and how, but the people on the panel here are doing it every day. And they're in a position, your panelists in a position to tell us what really is socio-emotional learning and what does it look like in each of your settings. And while much of the time we'll just dialogue randomly, I want to start here by having each panelist answer that question. Thank you. Let's start with you, Suzanne.
Okay. Again, thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming, and it's an honor to be here today. When we look at what is happening at Milwaukee College Prep and what has been happening at Milwaukee College Prep, we've had a long-standing of knowledge plus character pave the road to college and beyond. We have a lot of investments into our knowledge portion of that, and we have years and years of investment into our character education program, which has been our proactivity. But as with any investment, you want to monitor it, and you want to make sure it's going in the right direction, and you want to make sure that things are being able to see changes and see progress. So with our social emotional learning program, we are in our infancy of actually adopting a curriculum. We are 1 month in with our students at 100% rollout, and we are 3 months in with our staff with social emotional learning, and really choosing social emotional aspects that involve neuropsychology, development of the brain, and teaching our students and our staff about the ways that affects decision-making, responsible decision-making, and our relationships and self-control and emotional management, and how and optimism and positive psychology all play a piece in that. So right now we are one month into our rollout for all 4 campuses and making sure that we are just filling some gaps. It was really born out of a need from our teachers that our current proactivity, our current curriculum for character education was missing some aspects. So we looked into a lot of different programs, and we looked into making sure that we could fill gaps and bring our scholars exactly what they need to be successful.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Kim Marath. I'm the social emotional learning supervisor in Milwaukee Public Schools, and I work with a team, the violence prevention program in our district, and our work is really around social emotional learning as a broad concept, but then some more specific things like trauma sensitive schools and restorative practices and our second step curriculum and peer mediation. Mindfulness is a new program to our district as well within that arena. To me, social emotional learning is really about giving students and adults knowledge and skills and then opportunities to use those skills within the school environment. So it's about being responsive to the needs of our students and our schools, understanding that the things we are asking our students to do in school in a very social environment, we weren't necessarily giving them the prerequisite skill to be able to do it, and that they needed some kind of explicit instruction in terms of being able to meet the expectations that the school environment had for students. And then to create those opportunities where we are in staff meetings, are staff able to go through problem solving with the school leaders? Are students then being given opportunities to use those same problem-solving steps in the classroom when it comes to solving class problems or personal problems? So it's about kind of coming at it from a multi-pronged approach, both in explicit instruction, but then really allowing the opportunities to use those skills.
Hi. My name is Beth Herman. Oh, and my mic is now on. You all look fabulous from down here. I kind of feel like a professor. Okay, so pretty much what they said, but I want to add a couple points. One is that it's two parts. Kim kind of alluded to this. It's the acquisition of skills, but then also the application of them. So it's not just being able to tell somebody how you respond to a conflict. Well, I need to walk away or I need to negotiate, but actually being able to do that. As a psychologist, I know that those are two very different skill sets. And so sometimes we think that because we tell students how to do a certain task, that they should just be able to do that, and we know that that's not true. The other thing that I would say, and I want to touch on this only because it...
What are the skills that you're teaching? You guys are talking around, I think, me anyway, from the standpoint of understanding social and emotional learning.
We'll get there.
I'm
We'll get there,
getting
sir.
there.
Thank you.
In fact, that's where I was going next. Okay, well, I'll answer your question. So what came up was some things about character, right? And I don't know if Mr. Pieper is still here. Hi, Dick. Character is, when we talk about integrity, and Dr. Finn mentioned this, the skills that we're talking about are the things that you need to be able to do integrity. So let me explain that even further. If you are going to be somebody who lives in integrity, you're somebody who lives according to your value system. Would you agree with that? But you have to know what your value system is. And in order to know what your value system is, you have to be able to self-reflect and self-assess. And self-reflection and self-assessment are skills that we're talking about, among many. Okay? It's also being able to regulate your behavior and know what to do in a situation where you are being challenged, where you're being made fearful or anxious. It's being able to determine how another person might be feeling and then respond in a way that's appropriate, right? So that we could break that down in a number of ways. I think given our time frame, we can't. But I just wanted to demonstrate that when we talk about character ed, we're all on the same plate. We're just looking at getting to the same thing in a few different ways. And we need skills to be able to do that.
Good morning. I'm Karen Stoiber, and I'm a professor at UWM, and I direct the school psychology program. And part of my attraction to coming to UWM was the close association with MPS. So early in my work, about 15 years ago, I began meeting with groups of teachers and staff in a number of MPS schools and really trying to differentiate what makes a successful student and what are the characteristics or what are the qualities that we want to develop in these students to really promote success really in greater numbers. And I was kind of fully expecting that the focus would be on things such as promoting their, quicker learning, memory skills, interest in books. And what came out of those meetings, and it was consistent across the schools that I met, were really what we kind of know now as social-emotional learning. So there are really three things. One is kind of first the self-oriented skills, so things that were mentioned by Beth in terms of self-regulation, recognizing your emotions and when you're about to maybe blow up, and instead using strategies to really diffuse that tendency. And then other-oriented types of skills, so skills in really interacting in ways that promote friendship, that promote getting along, that we often talk about things such as having empathy and really understanding others' emotions. And then finally, really kind of more life-oriented skills, so being able to make good social decisions and noting, when you're entering a safe situation versus an unsafe situation, and really being, as mentioned, kind of being able to reflect that in a way that you can alter your behaviors so as to choose the safe as opposed to the unsafe. So those are kind of the big three ideas, and other, it's been defined in different ways by various experts. But I think importantly, this came out of work that I had done with staff in MPS, and then when I moved to other districts across the state, really found those same things are what mattered to the teachers in really trying to produce more successful students.
So let's get a little closer in to the classroom. How on earth does one teach the things like empathy and self-reliance and the ability to read others' emotions and to regulate one's own behavior? How does one teach that? Bring us into classrooms. Bring us into the spaces where we see children operating with adults and others. Anyone?
Well, I think some of the things that Dr. Finn pointed out are very accurate, and modeling is a big one. I think that there are teacher practices, such as using questioning techniques and being warm and caring, some of the very same things that Dr. Perry said. But it also does include, in some cases, explicit teaching of skills. For example.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So if you're trying to determine how another person feels, we can teach students, we can teach kids how to assess that situation and look at that. So what is that person's facial expression telling you? Now, this may seem very basic to a lot of people, but I can bet that you all know adults that aren't able to do this well. Am I right? So we teach them, how do you look at facial expressions, body language, what is the person saying, what is the tone? We can teach that. And empathy, that's part of it, right? So to be able to have that empathy, you have to be able to understand that person's perspective. I think we're sorely lacking in this in the modeling area in our country right now, but how do you hear another person's perspective? And how do you understand that perspective even if it's not your own? We can teach that.
So how do we teach it? Anyone? I mean, do we just tell kids this is the emotion that we see in this picture, or what?
Well, I think, so piggybacking off what Beth said, I think we start there. We start with the explicit, what do you see when you look at that person, when you look at that picture? But there's ways to bring it into academics as well. So when we're talking about literature, when you're reading a story, what are the cues within this story that tell you how that person is feeling? Some of our state standards require that you're able to read and write from another person's perspective. And so starting with that explicit instruction of taking that perspective of understanding and having someone explain how they might feel differently. So having debate and dialogue within classrooms related to how two sides feel about one issue. That's part of perspective taking, but it's a direct link to academics and the academic expectations we have for students.
And I would just like to add that we can align the ways that we know kids come to learn from the academic and in the socio-emotional realm. So just like we teach vocabulary explicitly, and we know that you don't just define the word, but then you want to be able to use it in a sentence and then embed it in context and practice the use of that word so that they get repeated exposure. Same things when we teach vocabulary such as a word like frustrated. And that, similarly, we want to kind of follow those same sort of cycles and make sure that we provide ample practice and not expect just one-time exposure that you're going to be able to then understand that and use that concept.
Well, as Beth said, there are some solid teaching practices that have social expectations built into them and opportunities then to use social skills. So like peer partnering or working in small groups. In order to work with a partner on something, you have to have some prerequisite skills that are not academic. You have to be able to listen to a person, you have to be able to respectfully make your point, you have to be able to respectfully disagree with that person and come to a consensus, and that may require some compromise. And those are skills that unless our students are kind of front-loaded and taught, here's the expectations, not just for what the output is academically, from this group project, but here are some expectations for how you function within that group, and here are some skills for being able to do that successfully, and what you do when it doesn't work.
So it sounds like you're teaching these skills both in the regular curriculum and then explicitly as a separate part of the curriculum. Is that the case? And how much time are we devoting to the explicit instruction around social skills and socio-emotional learning?
So I know in my K-8 situation, we have designated time that we teach those explicit skills and we run through a curriculum. But just like our proactivity, it runs throughout the day. So whatever language, whatever vocabulary, the teachers are holding a lot of responsibility for using it themselves and modeling it throughout the day, and then giving scholars the chance to practice throughout the day. When they see a situation, they use that moment as a teachable moment. Instead of punishment, consequence, they say, okay, what is your voice and choice in this one? What is your next best step? And what do we know about how our brain is working that we can... We use a lot of prefrontal cortex in our decision making, and where did that decision come from? And having the modeling come from the explicit instruction, that happens either in the beginning of the day or the middle of the day.
Great, okay. Let's come in even closer still, if you don't mind. I believe in stories. And so I'd ask you to share stories where you believe this has worked with real kids or real schools, or in the case of Beth, you may be talking about an entire district, but bring us close enough so we can kind of see the faces here. Any one of you.
So I know that teacher burnout is a real thing. And like I said, we are in our infancy of bringing it to our scholars, but we have been modeling and practicing with our staff for quite some time. And the other morning, maybe 2 weeks ago, all of our staff have chimes because we're also using mindfulness practices and bringing in times of the day to allow ourselves and our scholars to experience that. And it was very early in the morning. It was probably 6:45, and I heard a chime go off, and I was like, oh, what scholar is playing with their teacher's chime? And I marched down the hallway to issue some sort of consequence or something, and it was actually a teacher, and they were sitting at their desk with their palms up, and were using it for themselves. And I said, what, did I just hear your chime? She's like, I use it every morning to center myself and get myself ready for my day, and to make sure that I am practicing what I'm asking my scholars to do every day. I can only tell them the benefits of it if I'm experiencing those benefits myself. So it's not quite a scholar story, but it is a true story that is how I'm seeing an impact in the schools I'm working with.
I would echo that as well, that we are seeing staff share stories of how using mindful practices is helping them to be prepared for their day and also to handle challenges that come up throughout their days. Maybe when they themselves aren't feeling as regulated. We also have teachers who share stories with other staff members. In fact, one building I was in, this was before we adopted an SEL curriculum district-wide, where the kindergarten teacher was the one who got up and was advocating for her peers to be using this curriculum with their students because she saw the dramatic impact it had on the students' ability to focus and manage themselves, manage their emotions, and regulate themselves throughout the day. The other story that I'm always brought to is I came to this work pretty organically through my experiences as school psych in MPS as well, and observing the real challenges that my students were having and that my staff were having as well in navigating difficult situations. So our students come to us with skills. This isn't a replacement set of skills to replace anything that our students already come to us with. It's to give an additional set of skills. And so when students' skills weren't working, when they were in a situation and what they tried was not successful, they didn't have another set of skills to go to. And so by providing, and I started doing it small group individually and was really realizing that that wasn't where we needed to be going, that I could teach students things in my office, but they could go back into a classroom where those skills weren't known and also weren't reinforced, and then get themselves in the same situation they got themselves in the first place. And so really moving to whole class instruction on these types of skills and allowing the teacher to be the one who's providing opportunities then for students to use and reinforce those skills. And seeing then students who were able to stay within their classroom and manage themselves because that the person who was leading the classroom knew what it was that they were trying to do and could support them in that. The other way, my understanding of this work has really evolved over time, and as part of that it was due to my own daughter who is 8. and really seeing the impact that SEL has in her life. Now, she has the benefit of having a tremendous mother who understands these skills and the need for their instruction, and who I'm sure, has taught her the best way to handle herself in all situations. However, in school, she is encountering situations that I can't prepare her for, and I'm not there to help coach her through, and she has anxiety, which doesn't help, and so she needs to be taught these skills in an environment where she's being expected to use them. School is not a sit in your desk and have information dumped into your brain experience. It's a very social experience, and so it's really important for me as a parent that she be taught to stand up for herself in a school environment where she needs to learn to be assertive, and not just stand up for herself with other students, but stand up for herself with her teacher when she needs to understand something that she doesn't get. She needs to be able to advocate for herself. So watching her develop those skills has been a very personal but very rewarding experience for me, because it's not things I've taught her, it's things she's learning in her school.
I would just like to chime in that I think the change that we're seeing in schools is that this focus on social-emotional learning is really across the classroom. And it had been just, for particular students that had the challenging behaviors or were identified or known to have anxiety, that you may pull out and really focus on them in small groups in a more maybe intervention-focused manner. But now we're seeing that all students benefit, and across the range of needs and abilities. So for us in schools, really thinking how we can embed these in a way that becomes kind of routinized, and it's not, as mentioned, add-on, but rather it more naturally embedded, but yet we also know it needs to be focused on in an explicit way, because if we don't do it explicitly and provide some mentoring of the teachers and modeling and coaching of the staff, that it may not be done how we would prefer it to be done to really have the positive effects that we're intending. So it needs to be very intentional, and I think that's where it gets tricky when it's now not just specialized in a small group, but it really is across the curriculum, across the day.
Okay, go ahead. Well, two stories. One is an administrator shared that, this one's funny. Y'all look like you could use a laugh about now. She was moving through classrooms doing observations, right? And the chime went off. It was mindfulness time, and she's being an administrator, and she's moving through the room and being busy, and a little girl did this to her. Lady, you're supposed to close your eyes and be mindful now. So now we've got the kids training the adults. That's the way it really should be. The other thing, and this one isn't as funny, is when I was in MPS, one of the things that was occurring, this will probably date me a little bit, but we were really promoting conflict resolution. And not that conflict resolution is a bad thing, right? But conflict resolution maintains that people know how to use their words. And we would say to kids, sit down, talk about what's going on. And the kids would sit down and say nothing, and we'd think there was a deficit with the kids. And what we found as we started doing some work in MPS on this and looking at emotional vocabulary, for example, is that children had generally what I call the holy trinity of feelings. And I am in a Jesuit building. Sad, mad, and happy, right? Sad, mad, and happy. And they confused mad and sad all the time, because our kids would often present angry when they were feeling sad. But they didn't have the skills to name it. They didn't have the skills to understand it. They didn't even have the skills to self-reflect what it was that was going on with them. And then we're telling them to sit down and solve a problem. That's putting the cart before the horse right there. So, that was a personal thing for me, kind of an aha moment that turned that around. I do also want to say that when we talk about this, and I know we're talking about this in the context of MPS because this is the city that we're in, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say that these are skills all students need. Mm-hmm. Do not think that the kids that are in those more affluent districts that surround this city have these skills in spades, because they do not. The fact that they're not graduating college tells us that. These aren't skills that are only necessary for this group or this group. These are skills necessary for all kids. All of our kids we are having a mental health crisis with our youth. And social emotional learning skills are a universal starting strategy for good mental health for all kids. And I just feel a need to say that. I mean, we had some discussion about equity this morning. This isn't just about MPS's kids. This is all kids.
So what is this mental health crisis? I'm going to actually turn to you, Karen, as the researcher, and have us, if you would set the stage here, what is the real problem we're addressing here, and what does the research say about it?
Well, I think that we're realizing, and it perhaps it's come out of No Child Left Behind not producing the success that we had intended, right? Because that had a very, very well-defined focus on academic learning. And I had an early reading first grant, a couple of early reading first grants really promoting early literacy, and we were told that the focus should be on just those key early literacy skills, not on things like classroom management. But the teachers came to us and said, we can't get to the early literacy skills that you want us to teach unless we have a better skill set around classroom management and around really meeting the needs of all of our students. And that as much as you maybe would expect, I think previously the thinking may have been that these were skills that happen outside of school, that kids this should be learned in the home, or this should be learned in the community setting. And we're now in a crisis, because as was stated, our scores, especially in urban areas, they're not increasing in terms of proficiency levels. So what we do have are data that when you do social-emotional learning programs well, and compared to a focus explicitly on academic learning, that we actually produce not only better social outcomes, but we produce better academic outcomes. Those are the data that we now have from our research. I think the downside is that we still haven't yet figured out how to do it in a way that all classrooms are going to be able to achieve those results, because it requires particular teacher training, coaching, ongoing attention and monitoring of how those social-emotional learning components are occurring in classrooms.
Why now? Why is this such an issue now? What's different about the conditions of our lives and our children's lives that we're talking about this now?
I'll just jump in. I think it's a connection. We know that having a strong, healthy relationship with adults is a protective factor. I don't know if you're familiar with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's done through the CDC. The state of Wisconsin does it every 2 years. Our schools are also able to access a version of it online every year for themselves. They get to make some decisions about what questions they ask. But we ask kids things like, do you feel that there's an adult in the building that you can go to, that you feel safe talking to? And remarkably, we still do not have as high a scores on that as we want. I'm not going to give you a number because I don't know it off the top of my head. We just got recent data for the last survey. We also, and to address your question about mental health, I think this is relevant, is we have higher rates of suicide than we had before, higher rates of anxiety and depression. The kids are asked that question on the survey. I would say that I think we're lacking some connection. I think that our kids, and this could be or may not, I haven't seen data on this, about whether our screen world is impacting our actual personal connection world. I suspect it will show that at some point. There's some data to show that kids are interacting with one another through technology and media as opposed to sitting down next to each other and having conversations. But I suspect it's just a lack of connection.
Anybody else?
I don't know that it is just now. I mean, I remember when I was in elementary school that we had a social-emotional learning curriculum that our counselor came in and taught us, and it was about how to understand ourselves, how to understand other people, and how to interact with one another. And that was 30 years ago that I remember that happening. But I do think that To me, social emotional learning really represents the coming together of a lot of efforts that, we talk about drug abuse, AODA programs, and we talk about violence prevention programs, and you talk about conflict resolution programs, and that each of those, and bullying prevention programs, and each of those things cannot be addressed in isolation because they're not isolated problems. These are things that, under the umbrella of social emotional learning, it's a protective factor for all of those things. Having strong coping skills, having good problem solving skills, having good friends, those are protective factors when it comes to mental health, when it comes to substance abuse, when it comes to bullying. And I'll tell you, it's really hard to be a good friend to somebody who doesn't have any social skills. So having social skills is actually a prerequisite for them to have that protective factor. And so this isn't just a now, it's finally all coming together, that we're recognizing that these things are all related and that they can all be addressed through a fairly uniform approach.
I also think that pressure is off of schools a little bit because No Child Left Behind.
Yes.
To me, I saw a rise in, teachers always knew this was important, but the response would be, I have to do 2 units of math and 2 units of reading, and there's no way we can do this. And we're also moving beyond the notion that SEL is just curriculum, right? So it's much broader than that, it's bigger than that. We were talking about that here. But the fact that those testing requirements have been relaxed a bit, it almost feels to me, and this is the 3,000-foot view at the state level, that educators are breathing again, and that they're finding that they can find ways to do this now without that pressure.
Beth, I appreciate that you mentioned that this is not about just about children of color or children in poverty. And in fact, as in my role as an educator of aspiring principals, my students do case studies of their schools. And a paper that I read yesterday is from a student who is at one of the most, a high school in one of the most affluent suburbs of Milwaukee, and cited that data that question that you were talking about, the statewide survey. 60% of the kids in his school said that there was not an adult. He did not respond affirmatively to that question. There's an adult that I can turn to. But I'm having spent 29 years in the Milwaukee Public Schools and carrying that in my heart, I want to turn to that and to the issues of equity and opportunity that were raised this morning. And if you'll allow me to take a little time to sort of give us something to chew on and speak from my own experience, I'd like to do that. I would like to argue that we speak about the trauma that our children come with as if it comes from their families and from their neighborhoods. And we're not focused on the trauma that we, as educators and larger members of the society, are inflicting every day. And let me tell you what I mean by that. In Ann Arnett Ferguson's study she did a deep ethnographic study of the experience of black boys in an affluent, relatively affluent suburb connected to a major university in the United States. And one little vignette that she pointed to was a child who was super expressive and huggy, and her teacher said, she just really craves affection. She's just not getting it at home. And yet, another way to look at that is that here is a child that is raised to be loving and expressive. And I do think that even as we're teaching teachers about socio-emotional skills, we may not be getting at the kind of stereotypes and assumptions we're making, not examining in depth the experience of our kids' lives in the school, in the larger society that we are a part of. And when I talk about trauma in schools, here are things that I've seen. I've seen widely in schools and outside of schools. I mean, I'm talking about whether you're at a friend's house for a cocktail party or a service person comes to your door. One of the first things people say is when they find out that I'm an urban educator is they say, thanks a lot. I mean, that's really tough work, but it's not the teachers, it's the families. So there really is, deep in our social structure, the assumption that children come from families where they are not loved, where their families are not fiercely committed to education, and it's wrong. I have never, in 29 years in the Milwaukee Public Schools, met a parent who was not fiercely committed to their child's well-being and to their education. And they may not come up in suits and say, you know, when they're angry about what's going on in the classroom, for example, or in the school, they may not talk about their lawyers. They may come up loaded for bear and unprofessional in the way they express it, but they are expressing that fierce commitment. So that's one. It's just the way we think about families, sometimes without examining it. Another, of course, is the very well-documented differences in the way we discipline children, whether, and there, again, there's you know, academic research as well as collective experience in this room about how that happens, that the same behaviors get penalized if they occur, for example, in a black boy or Latino boy than, say, a white girl. There is, of course, more subtle sometimes, the way that cultural markers are interpreted as indicators of a kid's academic potential. And that can have very tangible effects in the kinds of intellectual opportunities kids are channeled into. And finally, I just worry about our use of the term the traumatized child. Once again, as if our children are coming to us not with great riches, but as kind of bundles of inadequacies and bundles of neglect. And so I pose that to you panelists, and thank you for letting me get on my soapbox, because as Alan Borsuk knows, I can't help it. But I'd like to hear your response. So there was something implicit in what happened this morning among our speakers that suggests that maybe socio-emotional learning is missing that mark. And I want to hear your response to that.
One thing I think you've challenged us, and sometimes you need to remove yourself from the situation to perhaps realize a culture within a school or within a district that becomes almost acceptable in the ways that we respond to families and student needs, that is not caring, is not nurturing, is not demonstrating trust, and just these aspects that we focus on in the social-emotional learning. And your comment, I think, for me, really raises consciousness, because when you've been in various schools, you can often walk into that building and within a couple of minutes have this understanding of the culture and how students are treated and staff are treated, and it may not feel comfortable or inviting to you, yet I think it becomes acceptable. And I think that's an issue. I think that's a really a big issue in terms of my fear is taking a program and saying, okay, now we're doing social-emotional learning in our school, but we really haven't done the work of changing that school culture and really addressing some things that really don't feel like it's good practice.
When we talk about trauma, I think this is, again, one more place where I'm going to say this isn't just about our kids. Mm-hmm. The Kaiser Permanente study that first did the ACEs work was done with middle-class, middle-income, suburban, primarily people who ended up having a large number of ACEs, in spite of the fact that they weren't urban or...
Define ACE, please.
Adverse childhood experiences, thank you. It's a very interesting study. If you haven't seen it, to look it up. And so trauma happens to everybody, but historical trauma, which I would maintain is part of what our kids are experiencing here in Milwaukee, the historical racial trauma, and poverty that creates, I know this was a question that came up earlier, poverty creates extra stresses that those of us that can pay the bills don't have to experience. Can exacerbate that. So that's just one thing that I wanted to say about that. But in addition to specifically ask about equity, Kim mentioned this before. we've created some social emotional learning competencies that schools can choose to use or not at the state level. It's been 3 years in the making. We've included a number of people, some folks that have been on our work group to create that wasn't just from the DPI or here. And our idea is that this is an additive model. Parents give their kids skills. I may not agree with the skills that parent gave them, but I also don't live in their neighborhood. I also don't have a life experience like theirs. So I can come to this place by saying they gave them the skills they feel they need, we can give them additional set of skills. So I also believe that if we are truly going to be equitable, and by that I mean all children have access to good jobs, higher education, they need these skills, right? I mean, employers are telling us, nationally and in the state, that they can train people to do some of these technical things. What they can't train them to do is how to problem solve with people who come from different backgrounds, which schools are really uniquely in a position to provide that opportunity, as Kim said. So I think that the equity piece of this also gets to the point of parents. A sure way to shut a parent down is to make them think that you believe that what they taught their child is wrong. We don't need adversaries with parents. We need the whole community. Both speakers this morning mentioned that. This is a community thing, not just schools. And so with parents, it's not an or, it's an and. With the community, it's not an or, it's an and. You gave them everything you did. Every parent is fiercely determined to make sure that their child has what they need. They just go about it differently. But here's another set of skills that we know that the work world and the future education that you may choose to do needs you to have.
Specifically, you give us a lot to chew on, so I'm not sure I can address all of that. So that is something that we had discussed before was SEL as an equity issue. And SEL is not the final answer, the end-all, be-all. It's not going to cure all the ills. But what it does do is equip students with some additional skills to help overcome some challenges. It was rolled out in MPS as part of our trauma-sensitive schools package, our initiative, related to educating our staff about what the impacts trauma has on both students and on themselves, and to use social-emotional learning as a set of strategies to be able to help address that, but that there are other things that we need to do as well. One of the conversations, and this is kind of one of the barriers, I think, to this work, is that I don't think amongst educators broadly, I'm talking teachers, support staff, administrators, that you'd find anyone who would disagree that having relationships with students is important, that they won't learn from you if they don't like you, that you have to have a sense of community in your classroom before the students will trust you and can kind of follow your lead and learn from you. But then when we start talking about, okay, so here's what we need to do, there's a roadblock that says, well, we have a lot of curriculum to get through. We have to get reading and writing and math and science and social studies done. We don't have time to focus on that. And that's like word for word a conversation I had on Monday. So we recognize a need. We say it has to happen. We say it has to happen in order for our students to achieve and to learn from us. And yet when push comes to shove, we can't do it because we have to focus on reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. And so it's kind of one of those, time to put your money where your mouth is, that if you think these things are important, we have to allocate the time for it to actually happen in our school day. And I'm not saying hours a day. I'm saying a lesson a week followed by those teachable moments, those opportunities when things come up. Teachers are taking time away from academic instruction to deal with social problems that come up in the classroom or come up on the playground or come up in the lunchroom or come up in the hallway. That takes away time from academic instruction, so why not allow it to happen in the context of a set of skills we're teaching our students anyway, to reinforce those skills. And I think that when you look at the academic proficiency of districts, if we have districts who are saying, well, we are academically proficient, we can take on this type of instruction and this type of work, it's further perpetuating the inequities that some of our students who are coming from schools who already are not academically proficient are then also not being given these skills to be able to, as Karen said, that it can actually improve their academics too. So it's perpetuating those inequities that are already existing within our systems. And then I also do want to go back to something that Andre Perry had said earlier in his conversation when we were talking before, the question came up of like, what does race have to do with this? And from my perspective, it was about, and I'll say this is my perspective as a white woman who does this work, was about social awareness and respect for diversity and understanding another person's thoughts and feelings and opinions, and they may be different than my own, but they're very real, and that we can come to an agreement, and whether it's agree to disagree or an agreement on really where we should land on an issue, to me, that was really the connection. But when I had this conversation in my office, one of my colleagues brought up some of the exact same things, and he is a male of color, that Andre was talking about in terms of that this is about empowering people, that this is about giving individuals a set of skills to be able to say, this is something I myself can do, that I have the skills and the competencies and the abilities to think about the actions I'm taking and the choices I need to make, and to recognize that what's happening right now is not okay, and that there is a way that I can go about saying that and getting my needs met and advocating for something better for myself. And while that's a very different perspective than what I had based on my background, the point is still valid that this is very much an equity issue and something that is important, and that, race has everything yet nothing to do with.
So what's Andre Perry made the point that I think he said, while the soft skills are very important, they're not as important as teaching our kids how to stand up against injustice in a way that is effective. And isn't there a danger that what we're really doing is teaching kids how to be polite?
Our competencies actually have a benchmark on advocating for self and others.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes when we think about social emotional learning, we think about it in a very narrow sense. But it's how do you take feedback and give feedback? How do you advocate for yourself and others? How do you look at your community? There's civic engagement as part of it as well. I think it's a lot bigger than some people realize.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're realizing it. I'm doing work with Boys and Girls Club in the after-school programs and Head Start. So it's becoming more pervasive in the sense that, it was mentioned in the panel that we need to start early. But again, there aren't really curricula that, other than sort of add-on programs where you spend, 20 minutes a day talking about those skills. And I think what's needed is that it's embedded. Yep. It's across the curricula. And that requires a new skill set for our staff as well. Mm-hmm. So if we're serious about this, we need to really dedicate considerable effort in our staff development, in our training, in ways that we examine practices in schools, so that it's not just something that we maybe give the talk to, but really aren't serious in how it really looks and is evaluated.
Yeah, it kind of seems, based on what some of our audience members have said, that this is really about the adults, that there are adults who go in and show care with every move, and at every moment are teaching children how to interact with care for one another. And so I want to turn first to you, Suzanne, and let's talk a little bit more about the adult side of this equation and how it is that you actually engage adults effectively so that they can go in and be those kinds of teachers.
There has been some bumps along the way when it comes to our adults, but I think the real proof of it is when we allow ourselves to step outside of our comfort zones. When we talk about the difference between being assertive and aggressive, and then when you see aggression, using that not as a consequence moment, a punish moment, but using that as an opportunity to teach assertion and to teach, if we come together. What's happening is like our world is very divided. We're a very divisive nation right now, and if we come to our students with a place of we are on the same page, we are the same, versus I am the teacher and you are the scholar and that is your parent, you move much further within this world, and you're able to push through more of that the self-nation, with our scholars, it is the communication, what has been designed to increase communication with like our technology has really pulled the reins back on how we're communicating and what messages we're getting from communication. We're taking out the tone, our cadence, we're taking out the facial expressions, and if you read a text message or an email, it can be perceived in many, many different ways. But if you start on common ground, and if you start with that empathy piece, and you find more similarities in the person that's in front of you than you find differences, then you're going to be more successful. You're going to build those relationships with each other, with your scholars, and with your parents.
So one of the things that we did when we first were introducing social emotional learning to the district is there's actually a staff self-assessment of SEL and your own social and emotional competence. And so that was introduced, not something that we made everyone take and then we, scored their responses or anything like that, but that they could take for themselves to identify what are some of my strengths and weaknesses as an adult when it comes to my social and emotional competence, because we all have them. And so that to me is a great starting point, because it's not saying, it's not something we want to collect, it's not something that somebody is going to evaluate you on, but when you can look at a profile and say, yeah, you're right, I do have some areas that I myself could work on, and then to be able to elicit those same skills in my students. And then it also relates to my response to your question previously about, isn't it just teaching everyone to be nice, is that, we as adults are really good at some skills, maybe not as good at others. Same thing with our students. My daughter has an overabundance of empathy, always has. She's also a pacifist, I'll say. And one of the skills that I've worked really hard to teach her is to stand up for herself and be assertive. That, a student pushed her down and I told her, you need to use your strong words and tell him, no, you need to stop. And she's like, I'm not going to do that. And I was like, no, you really need to do that. You need to be able to tell somebody that's not okay, back off. And so in some ways it's not. It's teaching kids to be mean, but in a nice way, to say that what you're doing isn't okay.
I think one thing that we're doing on our projects is that really starting with the teacher in terms of what is the change that they're hoping to make happen in their classroom. So if they're saying that my students are lacking self-control, it's then going back to, well, then what can the teacher be doing to promote self-control, right? And how are you teaching self-control? How are you modeling your own self-control, right? How are you really keeping this alive in your classroom? If they're saying that that the students are, not able to follow directions, well, let's go back and look at how are you actually being attentive to the ways that you're teaching them to follow directions, and what scaffolding do you have in your classroom? And often we give attention to this at the beginning of the year, but then about this time of the year it might really not be getting that same level of attention. So I think it's important to look at kind of what their needs are, but then going back and just as Beth talked about having these sort of goals and standards and benchmarks that we have for our students, well, what about for our staff and in the building, right? And it's not just teachers, it's across all the staff, and kind of setting personal goals for ourselves and being able to reflect on that and having opportunities that we can dialogue about those across the staff, so it's not just that one teacher sort of feels that this is something that she or he needs to address, but that it's really a shared community in moving along this path.
I also think it's caring for the caregivers. So we've talked a lot about what teachers should do, and I don't disagree with what we know works and that kind of thing, but we have a lot of teachers under stress. How many people in here are teachers? This isn't the best environment in Wisconsin right now to feel like you're a valued member of a profession. So we've got a lot of teachers who, while they may present initially with really great SEL skills, they're now put in very stressful situations where they're not able to bring their best self to the table. Part of what we're doing at the state is we're trying to look at ways to support adult staff wellness, because if we want these people to take care of our kids, which I think is essentially the biggest thing we can ask anybody to do, how are we taking care of them? And so when we're looking at how we're doing SEL for adults, we're kind of presenting it in that regard? I mean, this is a protective factor for adults as well as it is for kids. So how will these skills help you get through your day better? How will these skills help you do your job in a way that allows you to come back to work every day in spite of what's going on?
So let's just talk briefly about, the barriers that are in place and the challenges that are in place for you. And feel free, once again, to tell stories about where you've been frustrated, where this stuff hasn't worked, maybe yet.
Well, one thing that I was actually thinking needed to be addressed, and then Beth brought it up, but was related to a lot of our conversation is talked about classrooms that teachers need to, teachers should, students need. But the reality is that we work within a much bigger system than that. And that is one of our barriers and challenges as well, is no matter how small your school district or how big your school district, you are still a part of a system that needs to change to accommodate this type of work. That our teachers need support to be able to do to support our students in ways that we heard good schools do and good teachers do, which means our administrators need support to be able to support our teachers. And they don't just need support, they need support and permission, and they need resources to be able to do that, which means that the people above them need to provide the support and the resources to do this type of work in our schools. And the hierarchy continues on up, that there's a saying that what gets measured gets treasured, and that's what we see happen, that it's easy to throw these other things that good schools do out the window when what gets measured is reading and math and writing and other academic areas.
And I think Kim brings up the importance of resources. So when you have, for example, in my work, when you have large grants and you can bring resources and you can show outcomes and effects, but once those resources are removed, even when they know that this leads to better results, it fades away because of the lack of resources. So at a systems level, as Kim is mentioning, sort of thinking about how can we reallocate those resources so that we really seriously look at issues such as, inequity, and not just look at, sort of at the surface level, what's happening around, kids' discipline or, kids acting out behaviors, but really going deeper in terms of how can we move as a system to really seriously preventing and having a clear agenda on how we're going to keep this at the front as opposed to as different trends come in, that then it fades away again.
Suzanne? I want to give Suzanne a chance to answer that as well.
The biggest roadblock for when we propose it to our teachers is time. They ask when, how is this going, what does this look like in my classroom? When am I going to find the time to do this the right way? If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it well. I can't do it well with the time that's given. So it always resorts back to that time issue. And then, of course, the response is, well, how much time do you spend a day on management issues? How much time do you spend a day on one-on-one conferencing? How much time do you spend a day stopping teaching and dealing with behavior? And what if we just reallocated that time and seeing your proactivity time as one time, but the modeling and the lesson going on throughout the day, just like we always have advocated for. So it always comes down to those minutes at first, but the realization is that this is a whole school effort and a whole day effort.
Okay, we, just by way of concluding, I'll go back to my Marquette hat, where what my role is to prepare future leaders. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to send a message to my aspiring leaders.
Oh my.
Who would like to start?
I'll start, because, why not? All right, so this isn't going to be a coherent message, but it'll be a message nonetheless. I think my underlying theme would be to be responsive to the needs of your staff, to the needs of your students, to the needs of the families. I just had the opportunity to do a site visit to a school in Chicago, and if I could say, they're implementing restorative practices, But if I could say what I felt like the administration was doing, is they were responding to what they saw happening within that building. So they were re-envisioning what their dean's office who dealt with discipline, what that looked like and what it felt like when you went into that space, because they were observing the students who went in there, what they were going there for, what they needed, and then adapting that space and the interactions with the deans to meet that need. That the staff who were talking about their restorative practices implementation plan was considering what they're hearing from their staff and what the needs are from their students. And then they were developing the plan for how to move forward. I think so often I hear from teachers that the professional development they get has nothing to do with what they need right now. So to be able to be responsive to the issues that are coming up and help your student or your teachers feel heard and addressed, I think would go a long way. Thank you.
Castle just released results of a survey, I just saw it yesterday, where they surveyed leaders, administrators about SEL.
Yeah, once again, Castle is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning.
Thank you for being my
Yeah.
And while administrators said that they thought it was really important, they also said that they didn't know quite what to do to support it. So if I were to give a message to administrators, in my experience with y'all is that you don't always like to ask for help. If you feel you don't know how to do this, ask for help. Find ways to do that. Investigate, ask people, figure it out, because you're telling us that this is not a place that you're feeling very competent. That's something we can take care of. That's something Cynthia can take care of.
It's a collective.
I would just add, and I really echo what was stated here, but it's interesting because Alan mentioned earlier when was asked about the school that had made this remarkable change in 6 months and how did it happen, and his statement was, well, change leader. And interestingly, it had been the hallmark of effective schools was an effective leader. That has shifted. And it really is much more now about the school climate and the school culture. And although the administrator or the traditional leader is part of how that's established, I think we need shared ownership and shared voices and shared knowledge and understandings of how this is done. So often we may have perhaps minimized those opportunities for input. And with that, I'm including families, our community. And the more that it can become something that is bought into at the community level and not just the administrator, it's going to have a different effect. So wraparound programs, it really needs to go across not just the school day, but after school, before school, and really become something that we live and breathe and kind of figure out as we're going. And make adjustments because we don't have a clear way of how this is going to work effectively. It's much more challenging, much more complex than teaching mathematics and reading, and we haven't achieved that yet, right? So it's really going to take a community of effort.
My message is pretty simple. If we are going to ask leaders and educators and scholars to persevere through really hard things, we would be remiss if we did not teach our leaders, educators, and scholars how to persevere through really tough things. And so if we're going to expect them to tackle hard things, we need to be prepared to teach them how to tackle hard things and what that looks like in their lives and compared to the community and the systems that they're in.
Mr. Borsick, would you like to come forward and give some final remarks? Thank you. We're honored to have you here, and I want to thank our guests who are in the field every day. Thanks for caring about our kids.
Only some thank yous, really. Number one, to all of you for being here and being here for the morning, and a lot of really good thoughts and interesting thoughts that went by, and conflicting thoughts in some cases, and that's okay. We just put people up to try to provoke thought thoughts like this. Thank you to the members of the panel here, to Karen, to Beth, to Kim, to Suzanne, to Cynthia. Your ground level perspective was really valuable. A lot of really good issues coming up here. We will do more of this. We will do more of this on education. We'll certainly do more of this on a wide range of subjects. If you're not on the law school email list for our programs, either education or in general, Mike Goucher will be starting a new season of On the Issues when the second semester starts. We'll have other conferences coming up. Drop me an email and I'll be sure it gets to the right people here. I hope, Jeff Spence was a longtime member of the Milwaukee School Board, and he would always end spiels saying, go forth and do great things. And that's what I would say to all of you is we have so many kids, we have so many needs, we have so many opportunities. So let's take advantage of the opportunities and serve kids and make things better. That's my hope. Thank you for being here. Thanks to Andre Perry and to Checker Finn as well. Come again.